What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so with Superior Spider-Man, we're gonna cheat a little bit. And the reason why I say that is because of the fact that like the first three, really the first story arc's technically 3 issues, but we're gonna cover the first 5. Now, the reason being because of the fact that it'll allow us a little bit of leeway later on down the line when it comes to like one-shots and so on and so forth. Something else that I also wanna specify here is that it's well known by now, at least by most comic book readers, that the Spider-Verse storyline takes place during Superior Spider-Man. So I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do this. If I'm gonna simply stop Superior Spider-Man once we get to that point, and then cover all the stuff we need going into Spider-Verse, or if I'm just gonna cover Superior Spider-Man and then wrap back around and go into Spider-Verse. The only problem with that is that if we were to cover all of Superior Spider-Man and then cover Spider-Verse, towards the end of the Superior Spider-Man event, Dr. Octopus references Spider-Verse. So he'd literally be referencing an event that we haven't covered yet, or at least that I don't think we've covered very well. I did them before, but I didn't really like the way those videos were done before. So I'll get that figured out. I mean, we've got a little while. We've got, 20 some odd issues before we have to worry about that, but I think that, with regards to this little tidbit right here, what Dan Slott does is actually make Superior Spider-Man wildly interesting. And if I'm gonna be dangerous, I would say that I think Superior Spider-Man, I think Dr. Octopus is a better Spider-Man than Peter Parker. The reason why is just because really his ingenuity, how he just kind of revamps the spider suit and little things that he does on the side to kind of make his life a little bit easier, stuff that just Spider-Man just never did. And what this does is it actually kind of allows Dan Slott to tinker around with the Spider-Man mythos. It's almost like taking Peter Parker and throwing him into some, pocket universe and then just experimenting with stories. Using Dr. Octopus allows Dan Slott to introduce ideas to the Spider-Man mythos, and then if people like it, he'll just keep it going forward once Peter Parker returns. And so because of this, one of the things that was established in Amazing Spider-Man number 700, really a landmark issue in and of itself, it was a beautifully written story. It established the idea that instead of us as the reader expecting Dr. Octopus to become Spider-Man and just be a bad guy, instead he becomes a good guy. But the way that he does it is a little questionable, and that's one of the reasons why I like it. With regards to this, it's basically a reformed version of the Sinister Six that's composed of a handful of individuals, like Overdrive and, Shocker and so on and so forth, the Living Brain, different things like that. But it's kind of funny because we could kind of look at this and say that it's like a poor man's Sinister Six. Like it's nowhere near as great as, the Sinister Six that we're used to as it's led by Dr. Octopus. And even, Dr. Octopus is Spider-Man, we're just gonna call him Spider-Man just for the sake of this. But even Spider-Man comments on that. And, you can almost imagine him saying, back in my day, the Sinister Six was actually a deadly group. You guys are just goofballs. You guys are nonsensical. But the funny thing is that in the middle of fighting them, he actually bails off because for his first major fight as Spider-Man, he's going against a group of 6 people, all of whom have some pretty interesting and unique powers that, range anywhere from, throwing razor-sharp boomerangs all the way up to, the ability to administer massive amounts of electricity in terms of a shock. And so because of this, what ends up happening here is Spider-Man actually kind of dodges for a little bit, bobs and weaves, and they all basically make their escape. But in the process, he actually damages Overdrive with his, some little claws or something that he attached to his fingers. Now, on the surface, it seems like something totally irrelevant, and Dan Slott treats it that way. And in fact, what we end up doing is we actually just kind of switch over to Horizon Labs. And the reason why is because the Living Brain was basically defeated by, by Spider-Man, by Superior Spider-Man, and then turned around and taken back to Horizon Labs. Now, the reason why this matters is because of the fact that for those of you guys who have been reading all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man, you'll notice Dr. Octopus in the body of the Living Brain. Now, the Living Brain goes back quite some time in the Spider-Man mythos, but he was always just a small time thing. It was a robot that was created, eventually went awry, and that was it. I mean, that's really all there is to the whole history of the Living Brain. This is probably the most significant role that its character has ever played in the history of the Spider-Man mythos. But with regards to Superior Spider-Man taking the Living Brain, this is Dan Slott setting the stage for the return of Dr. Octopus in the body of the Living Brain with all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to say Dan Slott had this all planned out ahead of time, but I would say that it was more of like a fail-safe, that if, his stories took him in a direction where the bodies were switched back and Doc Ock lost his own body or something like that, he could come back in the form of the Living Brain, basically put his mind inside the robot. But the fact remains here that switching back over to Superior Spider-Man and following him further, what Dan Slott does is he takes all of this in phases. That's really what it is. It's just step by step. Now, initially, and one of the things that we had noticed Superior Spider-Man had been paying special attention to Mary Jane Watson as anybody would if she were actually real. And because of this, Dan Slott was kind of toying with the idea, maybe Spider-Man and Mary Jane Watson will end up getting back together. Now, in truth, if you're a Peter Parker, Mary Jane Watson fan, Superior Spider-Man and Mary Jane Watson is just not the same. It's not equal. They're not on par. It's like kissing your husband's twin as opposed to your actual husband or wife or whatever the case may be. It's just not the same thing. It looks the same, it feels the same, but it's not. And so because of that, one of the other things that Superior Spider-Man comments on is, of course, the view of Mary Jane Watson, everything between the waist and the neck. So that's the nicest way I know how to put it. But the cool thing about this, and one of the reasons why I really like Superior Spider-Man, is because of what he tells her. During their conversations, when they're kind of going back and forth and they're talking about the Sinister Six and, you know, where Superior Spider-Man's kind of making the moves on Mary Jane Watson, what he says is that where he had slashed at Overdrive, instead of just scratching him, what he had done is he installed a ton of nanobots inside of him so that he'd be able to trace their location and overhear their conversations. And that's why I say this is so cool, because you wouldn't really see this in a Spider-Man story. And so it's just kind of revolutionizing, and it's really like updating Peter Parker for the modern times. And there are a lot of people who will say, well, no, he doesn't need to be updated. He needs to keep living in the 1960s. No, I mean, seeing him updated here, I think is actually pretty stellar. Seeing new tools that are used, new implementations, different things like that are actually pretty interesting in terms of how it unfolds. And so because of this, he knows exactly where the Sinister Six are going to strike. He knows what tactics they're going to use. He knows where they're going to enter the building from, all that kind of good stuff. And so because of this, as soon as he encounters the Sinister Six the second time, he has everything put in place in order to make sure that he can basically win, to make sure that he can take out every single one of them. And that's exactly what he does. I mean, he basically just defeats them all. And so because of that, what ends up happening as a story or as a segment begins to wind up is we actually find out that Peter Parker, as we think of him, is not gone in his entirety. In fact, Peter Parker's still there. He's still in his body. The problem is that he exists in the subconscious. So all he can do is just watch the things and comment on the things that Superior Spider-Man is doing, but he can't actually interact with him. He can't actually talk to him directly. Now, the other half of this is that with regards to Superior Spider-Man conversing, you know, with Mary Jane Watson again, you know, continuing to try to keep the idea of this romance going, he's running into the same problem that Peter Parker always ran into, where he never had any time for his private life because he was always on patrol, because he was always out doing his own thing. And so what happens is Superior Spider-Man says, well, then let's take it a step further. I don't need to be everywhere. I just need to be able to see everywhere. And so what he does is he takes the concept behind his Octobots, which are these little robots that allow him to monitor things that are going around the city and carry out his own schemes. And he basically develops Spider-Bots. These are his eyes and ears. It allows him to see everything going on in the city of New York. And it's amazing the way it unfolds. I mean, to me, that's such a genius idea. Why go everywhere when you can just have these little nanobots, these little robots monitoring the city for you and then respond appropriately? Now, the funny thing about this is that at this point, he actually asks Mary Jane Watson on a date, and he is terrible at going on dates. Like it's disastrous when he takes her on dates. Like he tries the yawn and put the arm around her move. Like he takes her ballroom dancing. I mean, dinner and dancing is always great. Like dinner and dancing is always a great way to go on a date. I mean, you have a great meal, you have your conversation, and then you just have fun by going out and dancing somewhere. The problem with where I live in Kentucky is all there is just bars where you go and drink and just get drunk. So any woman that you could pick up at a bar, you know, is probably not a girl that you want to take home. But the fact remains here that he's not really one, you know, Superior Spider-Man is not really one for dinner, like for dancing. I mean, he's one for dinner, but not really for dancing. And so it's kind of funny, you know, because what he does is he shifts the mood. And instead of, you know, dancing with Mary Jane Watson, what he does is he actually takes her web slinging. And that's actually a really romantic thing to do. Like take her web slinging. Remember, she's done this before, but they've never really done it like together in a way like this. The problem is that when he gets her back to her place, he gets shut down in the worst way, because remember, Peter Parker's old girlfriend, Carly Cooper, is friends with Mary Jane Watson, and the two, like, she's basically invited Carly Cooper over to hang out with her when the night is over. And so it's basically like, sorry, Superior Spider-Man, but you got to go home alone tonight. And that's that sucks. And so the crazy thing about this is that with Peter Parker basically watching the entire event unfold, remember, as a subconscious aspect of his own body, he basically is forced to follow Dr. Octopus, you know, Superior Spider-Man, when Superior Spider-Man says, well, I don't necessarily have to be with Mary Jane Watson. I can just relive all the memories of Peter Parker. And so Peter, as a subconscious thought, has to follow Dr. Octopus as he remembers all the times that Peter and Mary Jane Watson were together, every single intimate moment they ever shared, which is crushing. That's a terrible thing to have to see. But at this point, we kind of switch back over to MJ's, and the reason why is because of the fact that the Vulture has basically sent, some of his henchmen, over towards Mary Jane Watson to more or less ransack the place and wreak all kinds of havoc and things like that. And of course, Mary Jane Watson is taken by, the Vulture's henchmen, and Superior Spider-Man rescues her. But when Superior Spider-Man goes after the Vulture directly, what ends up happening here is the Vulture basically reveals that where he's used different people for his own schemes over the years, that what he's done here is he's actually taken, or he's basically using children. He's using them for his own ends. Now, he's using them in terms of like having them carry out nefarious deeds, rob places and commit crimes and things like that. But he does it by giving them like arcade tokens and stuff, which is kind of funny, but it also strikes a chord in Superior Spider-Man. And the reason why is because of the fact that when he's facing off against the Vulture, that when one of the Vulture's henchmen goes to attack him, he hits the henchman and realizes that it's a child. The reason why this is so significant is because Peter Parker, as a subconscious thought, jumps into a memory of Dr. Octopus, and we learn that Dr. Octopus's father was an abusive man. And so it's like Dr. Octopus basically feels like he's becoming his father, abusing children. And so because of that, it strikes a particular chord in Superior Spider-Man, and he loses it, immediately goes after Toomes, goes after Vulture. The other half of this is also the idea that he's had enough. Now, that's why I say Superior Spider-Man, I think, is more interesting than Peter Parker, because Peter Parker has fought these guys time and time again, but Peter Parker's philosophy is that's just the nature of being a superhero. The nature of being a superhero is you fight bad guys, the bad guys will get free, you have to subdue them, you put them in jail, they get free, and they go and they do the same thing all over again. That's just the nature of being the superhero. That's the price you pay for keeping the streets clean, while also making sure that you do not fall down the path of being a bad guy. For Superior Spider-Man, it's not that way. He is not nearly as tight-knit as Peter Parker is. He's not nearly as clean as Peter Parker is. He's a lot more dirty here. He basically thrashes. He takes Adrian Toomes, he takes Vulture, throws him into this spotlight designed to basically signal, Spider-Man. It was a terrible idea when it was first introduced, when Superior Spider-Man literally chastised J. Jonah Jameson for doing it. He's like, why would you make a spotlight that would tell everybody where you are so they can come and find you and then like kill you or kidnap you and hold you for ransom? Like, that's a stupid idea. Just like call me if you need me or something like that. It was kind of a funny exchange between the two of them, but he sends Vulture crashing into this thing where he's just kind of cut to ribbons, and Superior Spider-Man does not feel bad about it. With Carly Cooper arriving on the scene, it's him basically saying, this is what I'm about. Like, this is, I've had it up to here with these guys. It's time that they be put away. And so what this does is this transitions over to the next phase, which is really Superior Spider-Man kind of rounding up these loose ends, grabbing these different henchmen of Vulture, rounding them up, having them, thrown to the child services, calling it a day, but also the idea that he's also, dealing with Aunt May. And the reason why is because remember, after Aunt May's injury, she's still learning to walk, still learning how to use her legs properly, but a cane is going to be a necessity. For Superior Spider-Man, this is ridiculous. He's like, why does she need a cane? I'm a genius. I will basically create a device that will hook up to her leg, and then she can control it using her mind, and she can walk just like a normal human being. The issue with this is that Dan Slott does not forget about the idea of villains. Now, the idea of Dan Slott, like, he never really loses track of villains. For him, it's always like, there has to be a main villain. Now, again, this is not a terrible thing. It's just, for me, I would rather there be a little more emphasis on, Superior Spider-Man, but the great thing is that we're currently 4 issues in. So with 33 issues running, there's all kinds of emphasis on Superior Spider-Man, especially when we get to Anna Marconi, which she's a character that I absolutely love. I love Anna Marconi. She's such a great character. But what we end up doing is we basically pick up with the return of a guy named Massacre. Now, Massacre is a guy named Marcus Lyman, and Marcus Lyman is a guy who basically sustained an injury to the brain. His wife was killed, but he essentially lost all connection to humanity. He doesn't value life, so he's basically like the Punisher if the Punisher were a bad guy. Well, the Punisher is kind of a bad guy, but he's like the Punisher if he were a bad guy and carrying out schemes. And we'll find, you guys will see, what kind of things he gets into. But Massacre basically breaks his way out, of Ravencroft Asylum, and kind of goes on this campaign, and we'll find out exactly what it is that he does. But the introduction of Anna Marconi comes by way of the fact that Superior Spider-Man is really angry because Peter Parker never got his doctorate. He's not actually a doctor. He's just Mr. Peter Parker. And in the mind of Dr. Octopus, he's like, that's ridiculous. Otto Octavius is like, why shouldn't Peter Parker have his doctorate? So the funny thing is, something that I hope you're noticing here is that like Dr. Octopus Octopus is basically making life better for Peter Parker. He's getting his doctorate. He's going to lay the groundwork for Parker Industries, massive worldwide company. He's basically setting the stage for making Peter Parker's life better in some ways. He's making it rough in others, but he's making it in some ways. But, going into his first class, a class with a guy named Professor LeMays, because of the fact that, Superior Spider-Man's kind of mouthing off, the introduction of Anna Marconi comes when she gives Superior Spider-Man a note saying, hey, look, you should come tutor with me and I'll help you get past this class. Now, switching back over to Massacre, what ends up happening here is, of course, Superior Spider-Man's alerted to what's going on with the idea that Massacre had escaped and so on and so forth, but Massacre is actually holding up a place called Burger Town and basically ends up shooting the place up when one of the guys tries to alert the cops. But what Massacre does is he engineers his own escape. Now, this is the cool thing about this, and this is why I say Massacre is a lot like the Punisher. The Punisher can easily be viewed as like just this mindless beast, this guy that just runs around and just shoots stuff up and that's it. That's why I loved Garth Ennis's Punisher Max so much, because it puts so much focus on Punisher as a person. It puts so much focus on him as an individual and what he's capable of. That's one of the reasons why I thought it was so significant. But what ended up happening with the Punisher's character, or what ends up happening with Massacre kind of juxtaposing the two together, is that the Punisher is very, very capable. He's pretty intelligent. I mean, he's not genius level, but he's intelligent in terms of military tactics, conventional warfare, that kind of thing. Massacre's very similar to that in the sense that he basically engineers his own escape by taking a woman hostage, but no one knows that he's taken her hostage. No one knows about her. And so because of this, Superior Spider-Man actually goes to Uatu, not the Watcher, but one of the members of Horizon Labs, and says, look, you develop facial recognition software. I need that so I can install it into my spider bots and have my spider bots scan the city looking for the face of Massacre. Yet another instance where Superior Spider-Man shows to be a lot more resourceful than Peter Parker. And so because of this, what we end up doing is following Massacre when he basically, drops this woman off in the middle of the city and then blends in, when he basically says, look, you go that way, maybe I'll follow you. And if I hear you say anything, if I hear you shout out, I'll kill you, or I'll just blend into the city. So basically just kind of feeding on fear of the idea that this woman may be shot if Massacre's actually listening. And instead he just kind of wanders off and goes away. And so because of this, what we find out is that the journey of Massacre actually takes him to the place, or to the residence of a woman named Miranda Pullman. Now, the reason why this matters is because of the fact that Miranda Pullman is a CEO of a company called Fizzy Cola. And the idea here of Massacre is to basically just make a whole bunch of money by having Miranda pay him $12 million to walk through the streets of New York, murdering people while wearing her competitor's shirt, basically creating bad press for her competitor. And so it is... it's just basic. It's just money is all it is. It all just comes down to something pretty simple. Now, of course, we end up having, Dr. Octopus send his bots out into the city in order to monitor everything. But this is when we get into Anna Marconi. This is why I love her character so much. So Anna Marconi, when Superior Spider-Man first encounters her, she's a diminutive woman. She's a person of a certain size. And so because of this, she basically says, look, I'm here to tutor you on, Professor LeMay's class in order to help you pass. Now, of course, the funny thing about this is that Superior Spider-Man is like, look, I didn't come over here to be tutored. I came over here to stop sending me your texts. And we know this makes sense because we know that he would easily pass LeMay's class. I mean, that's just one of those things where it's like, he would easily make it through there, no questions asked. But what ends up happening here is Anna says, no, you're here for a class, I'll go ahead and tutor you. And every tutor, every session that's 60 minutes, or I'm sorry, that's 1 hour and it's 60 minutes, comes with a home cooked meal. Now, let me tell you something, man. Like, if a tutor was like, hey, I'll cook you dinner and tutor you, I would be like, okay, like, I'm down. Like, even if she's just telling me stuff I already know, I would be like, I'm down for a free home cooked meal. Like, yeah. Not only that, like, because of the fact that he shows her how intelligent she is, she then turns around and gives him dessert. So he gets a home cooked meal and dessert, only to find out that the food is incredibly good. So I'm just like, wow, what a catch. Like, I would definitely stick with that chick. That's why I love Anna Marconi, because she's just such a great, interesting, unique character in the realm of what's going on in Superior Spider-Man. She's just cool. And so because of that, we switch over to Massacre, who's just shooting the place up. He's basically just kind of, firing bullets in every direction and so on and so forth. Superior Spider-Man shows up, but this is when he kind of starts to learn the lessons of Peter Parker. And what I mean by this is when Peter Parker first became, really first developed the powers of Spider-Man, the death of Uncle Ben is what led him to become a hero, to make sure that nobody else went through the same experience that he did. The death of Gwen Stacy taught Peter Parker that he can't be reckless, that he has to pay attention to the things that he's doing, that even if he doesn't mean to, people can die by his own actions. And so because of this, Peter Parker, again, as a subconscious thought in the mind of his own body, is basically, trying, screaming to Dr. Octopus, you have to stop this fight. Now, Dr. Octopus gets kind of carried away a little bit, but even then, he begins to learn when other people are being killed while he's still present. He begins begins to learn what's going on. Now, what he had done is he had basically used his bots and realized that there were individuals who were being held hostage by Massacre. And that was part of Massacre's plan, was to have 5 or 6 individuals in a warehouse covered with incendiary devices, and that if Superior Spider-Man showed up, he would detonate those devices and kill them. Now, because of these bots, Superior Spider-Man was able to deactivate these incendiary devices, free those individuals, and so now Massacre has no backup plan. The other half of this is Superior Spider-Man shoots Massacre, shoots him in the shoulder. And so the idea is like, Peter Parker, is this incorporeal thought, this subconscious thought says, look, that's not how we do things. We don't kill people. That's the price we pay for being a hero. We have to let the bad guys go to prison. We have to let them live. We have to let them serve their debt to society. And if they escape, then we have to go track them down. And it's just a really, really cool exchange here because of the fact that Superior Spider-Man has to come to grips with this. He even addresses this. He even says, look, it would be so easy to just kill this guy. That's what creates an interesting case here because, it's like the idea of repeat offenders. If everybody who committed a crime was killed, people would say, well, but that's not going to deter people from committing crimes. Well, it's not meant to. It's just to eliminate repeat offenders. A person can't commit a crime again if they're dead. And that's the philosophy that Superior Spider-Man takes here. Like, if this guy goes to prison and he gets out, he'll be a repeat offender. But if I kill him, then the number of crimes goes down by that much. So, why let this guy live? But ultimately, he basically sides and says, I can't do it. Not only that, Massacre more or less is forced to feel fear. Now, that part of the story is interesting for what it is. I mean, it's not wildly relevant. It's just kind of a way to bring it to a close, but it's basically Superior Spider-Man saying there's only one way that this can end. There's only one way that this can come to a close, and all we see is a shot being fired. And so the indication that's given to us here is that with this shot being fired, Superior Spider-Man just killed Massacre. And that's what makes this kind of wild, is because Superior Spider-Man's kind of a murderer now. And that's what makes this so unique, so that's so interesting to me. But ultimately, this whole segment wraps up when he has his bots basically travel over to Pullman and say, look, I know what you did. I know about your secret bank account. I know that you paid Massacre to do what he did. You are the hand behind murder. And so, while we don't necessarily see what happens to her, he says either you can go to the police and tell them what you've done, or you can answer to me and I will kill you. And so that's the interesting thing about this, is because it's Superior Spider-Man basically saying, I will kill if it's necessary. If it means preserving the life of other people, then I will kill him. I will kill them. If it means that I can spare countless other individuals, then I will murder a person. Okay. So getting into Superior Spider-Man Volume 2, this again is where Dan Slott kind of goes through this phase of kind of taking things in steps, taking things in small little portions here and there. Really, when Superior Spider-Man first started, almost at Superior Iron Man, which I really want to cover that story at some point, but when Superior Spider-Man first started, there were a lot of thoughts of people saying, well, Spider-Man's going to come back. Peter Parker is going to come back to normal. He's going to come back to being himself. And he is. I mean, you can't do something like Superior Spider-Man and get rid of Peter Parker forever. He's too intrinsic of a superhero. It'd be like killing off Superman and never bringing him back. Because of that, we knew that Spider-Man was going to come back later on down the line. But in the interim, Dan Slott and Marvel were playing this up as though Peter Parker was gone forever. And so while we had this subconscious aspect of Peter Parker in the mind of his own body, despite the fact that Dr. Octopus was basically taking control of Peter's body, in the end, what the story is going to do is basically eliminate that entire idea and bring forward the notion that Peter Parker's gone forever. Now, the way this initially picks up is it actually joins us with a guy named Dr. Elias Wortham, who also goes by the name of Cardiac. Now, Cardiac is a guy who dates all the way back to Amazing Spider-Man number 342 in 1990, but in truth, it was really just like Elias Wortham. He didn't really become Cardiac until like 2 or 3 issues later, something along those lines. But the idea here was that he was basically a vigilante, but not in the traditional sense. And that's one of the things that made his characters interesting. Cardiac was actually a guy who took the law into his own hands for the betterment of society. And so what he was doing is he was basically fighting against criminals. He was fighting against guys like Justin Hammer, different things like that. So he wasn't really like a traditional bad guy or a traditional anti-hero like the Punisher. He was actually doing good things. The idea here, though, is that Elias Wortham is basically taking over the heart clinic. Now, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do really, Spider-Man Big Time going forward, because of the fact that a lot of things that were taking place in Superior Spider-Man referenced the events of Big Time, and some of them even referenced some of the events before, but really Big Time is all we needed, since the bulk of the references really come from Dan Slott's first time taking over the series as a solo guy. But the idea here is that Elias Wortham is basically running this sort of underground hospital. And that's kind of cool here, because what we end up finding out from the perspective of Elias Wortham, one of the big issues with modern day hospitals is cost. The idea that people go in, they have, pre-existing conditions, yada, yada, yada. And it's really Dan Slott's way of saying, this is the biggest problem with society at the moment, is that you have people who need legitimate medical attention, but they're basically knocked down on the donors list because they have existing conditions, or because they're just not as high up, somebody registered before them. And it's really just one of these ideas where it is a lot of people need more help than there is help that's actually available. And so because of this, we end up finding out that Elias Wortham has been going through and launching these little attacks where he's basically been stealing supplies from places in order to provide his people with the help that they need. But these supplies that are being stolen are supplies that were confiscated from criminals. So it actually kind of begs an interesting question. Is he really doing the wrong thing, or is he doing the right thing, or is he doing the right thing for all the wrong reasons? I'm sorry, is he doing the wrong thing for all the right reasons? And so because of this, again, it kind of throws us in a moral quandary. And that's one of the things that I love so much about Dan Slott's Superior Spider-Man, is it really brings a lot of moral philosophical ideals into the equation. I mean, we talked about that in the last video when Superior Spider-Man killed Massacre. If you kill one man to save 1,000 people, is it the right thing to do? It's good old-fashioned Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill utilitarianism. The sacrifices, or I guess the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. But the moral implication here is, at what point does that stop? We saw that with like Superman, for example. Topple the governments of the world so the billions of people who exist can live without the oppression of government. So again, there's a point at which you simply just have to stop. And that's when it comes to the whole philosophy of morality and so on and so forth. It's really the line drawing. Now, of course, because of the actions of Elias, because of his actions, his cardiac breaking into facilities, so on and so forth, stealing the things that he needs, what this does is it basically has, the police for New York investigating, or at least alerting Superior Spider-Man. Now, when he arrives on the scene, right off the bat, he immediately attacks Elias. Now, again, Peter Parker exists as this sort of subconscious thought, and occasionally he can intervene. And what this will actually show us is he can still influence the body and even the mind of Superior Spider-Man. But because of this, Peter Parker's screaming in the background, look, this guy is not a bad guy. He's doing all the right things or all the wrong things for all the right reasons, but he's trying to do good. He's trying to do what he's supposed to. And so because of this, the first indication that we get of Peter Parker being able to influence Superior Spider-Man is when he screams to stop, and it simply just catches the attention of Superior Spider-Man. Now again, these are disembodied voices. In the mind of Superior Spider-Man, he doesn't know what's going on. All he's hearing is just a voice somewhere telling him to stop. We'll also see here in a little while that it'll actually, Peter Parker will start moving his own hand at different things like that. But again, this is basically just I guess an effect of the two of them fighting one another. But when we end up finding out that Elias is here to basically steal something called the neurologic scanner, which is designed to basically map the human brain, Superior Spider-Man realizes that as Dr. Octopus, he made that device. And so in his mind, Cardiac is stealing something that inherently belongs to Dr. Octopus. Now, this is a funny situation because what this does is it throws into sharp relief the idea that despite the fact that Dr. Octopus took over the body of Peter Parker and is now operating as Spider-Man, he can't quite let his past go. He can't quite let go of the fact that he was a bad guy, the things that he invented. If this was a wholesale relaunch, if this was a wholesale idea of Dr. Octopus walking away from his past, he would simply say, well, you can have it. That's my past life. But the fact that he feels like it still belongs to him means he simply can't let that go. Now, from here, it is the idea of him trying to figure out what's going on inside of his own mind, and the idea that Peter Parker had basically stayed his hand, despite the fact that Superior Spider-Man was going to kill Cardiac. And so at this point, it's basically Superior Spider-Man tagging Cardiac with one of these, little spider trackers so he can track his location, as well as Superior Spider-Man going back and see if he can't figure out what's going on with his own body. Now, what ends up happening here is in the middle of his investigations, he's basically contacted by the Avengers. Now, this is actually kind of a funny situation because it's basically Superior Spider-Man versus the Avengers. And what Dan Slott did with this is he designed this explicitly, or really wrote this explicitly for the purpose to show us how Spider-Man would stack up against the Avengers, because we haven't really had a reason to see a story where he takes on the entirety of the Avengers, because Spider-Man's always been a good guy. He's always been a guy that fought on behalf of the Avengers, but he never really fought against them, at least not as a person who was literally trying to do them harm. And so because of this, the Avengers basically call him in and say, look, we've been watching the things that you've done. You've taken a far heavier hand with villains than you have in the past. You killed Massacre. You almost killed Cardiac. What is going on with you? Now, of course, because of the fact that they basically want to take him and conduct a full scan, a whole battery of tests, the fear of Superior Spider-Man is the Avengers will figure out what's going on with him. They'll actually figure out that Dr. Octopus took over the body of Peter Parker. And so, of course, this leads to a skirmish between these members of the Avengers, Superior Spider-Man himself. Now, keep in mind, this is not like a full contingent of the Avengers, but the ones who are here are nothing to laugh at. I mean, you've got Wolverine with his heightened senses, Captain America with his agility, you have Thor, you have Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman. I mean, you have some pretty formidable guys here. And of course, Black Widow. I don't want to leave Black Widow out. But what ends up happening here is there's basically reference made to the idea that that Superior Spider-Man, I'm so used to saying Peter Parker, that Superior Spider-Man's spider sense makes it almost impossible for the Avengers to take him out. And that's something that I want want to kind of talk about here for a second. Really, in my mind, and for the longest time, and Sal over at Comic Pop will tell you this, for the longest time, I always thought Peter Parker was just a stupid character. Like, I never liked Spider-Man. I was like, hey, look, he's popular, people like him, whatever, I don't really care. But, you know, after really analyzing him further and going through these stories, and as well written as a lot of these stories are, one of the reasons why Peter Parker, you know, as Spider-Man, and even, you know, Dr. Octopus as Superior Spider-Man, one of the reasons why, you know, he's such a formidable hero is because of the fact that his spider sense basically alerts him of danger before that danger ever happens. And so he's always a step ahead of the person that he's fighting. One of the best ways to look at this is that the best offense is a good defense. And so because of this, you know, with Superior Spider-Man having the ability to know attacks that are going to happen before they happen, even if he doesn't know exactly what the attacking person is going to do, it keeps him out of harm's way. And so what this means is he can turn around and routinely stay on the offensive so long as his spider sense is working adequately. Now, of course, you know, in a moment of distraction, when Peter Parker is basically distracting Dr. Octopus, what this does is it grants the Avengers a brief moment of reprieve, which of course we're able to use to essentially topple him. But at this point, Dan Slott kind of makes the Avengers look like buffoons, which is not something that I'm really on par with. I mean, I love the Avengers. I mean, the Avengers are one of my favorite teams, but to make them look like buffoons is not something that I'm that I'm too partial with. But basically what happens is after all these different tests, Captain America says, we've confirmed you're not a Skrull, you're not possessed by, you know, some ghost out in space somewhere, no one's taking control of you or anything like that. But in the moment of analyzing these brain patterns, Dr. Octopus realizes that there's brain patterns that should not be there. Now, he doesn't know that it's Peter Parker. All he knows is his brain, the patterns are not where they're supposed to be. And so because of this, you know, while Natasha Romanoff is having this conversation with Superior Spider-Man, talking about the first time she killed and how, you know, the fact that Superior Spider-Man killed Massacre is going to stick with him whether he knows it or not, Peter Parker takes control of Dr. Octopus's hand while he's kind of idle and basically draws out this little diagram indicating that Dr. Octopus stole the body of Peter Parker. Now, the problem with this is that this is a very basic drawing, and Dan Slott plays it up this way. Dan Slott plays it up to us, you know, so that we look at this and we're like, well, how in the heck is she supposed to know that Dr. Octopus took control of Peter Parker's body? You know, but at the very least, it would send off an indication that there's something legitimately wrong with Spider-Man. And so because of this, you know, Natasha Romanoff, who of course would be able to put two and two together eventually, what this will do is kind of set her, or at least it sets the possibility up that she's going to end up on this course where she's going to start investigating what's actually going on with Peter Parker. Now, switching back over to Cardiac, of course, with Dr. Octopus, Superior Spider-Man using the spider tracker and eventually, you know, locating where he's at, the two of them engage in a skirmish once more. But in the middle of this whole fight, basically it leads into this operating room, and this is when Superior Spider-Man begins to realize that the reason why Cardiac is doing this is to save the lives of people. And so the whole crux of this was that despite the fact that he had taken this scanner from, you know, that had previously been built by Dr. Octopus, Cardiac did not know how to use it in its entirety. And so what this does is it basically sets the stage for Dan Slott to continue Superior Spider-Man down the role of being a good guy when he looks at this and says, well, I'm the one who designed this machine. I know how it works better than anybody else. I can literally help fix this girl, and I can turn around and perform the surgery myself. And so, of course, again, because of the fact that this is completed, the little girl is saved, it basically continues this trend of Superior Spider-Man becoming a good guy. And so taking that machine back to his lab and then investigating further, he directly acknowledges Peter Parker. He says, look, I now realize you're the voice inside my head. I now realize that I didn't take over your body in its entirety, that, you know, for some reason or another, your consciousness is still there. Now, after doing a little more investigating after that, what we find out is that this essence of Peter Parker that's talking to Dr. Octopus is basically an amalgamation of his memories, in the sense that as long as Dr. Octopus uses the memories of Peter Parker's essence will always be there. And this is really Dan Slott essentially saying that we as people are effectively just a combination of all our experiences. Everything that makes us who we are the things that we've been through. And so because of that, Peter will always be alive so long as his memories are there. And so Dr. Octopus takes the most logical step and simply says, we have to purge these memories from my mind. Now, this was actually a really cool segment of the story, because this pits Peter Parker and Dr. Octopus against one another in a way that hasn't really been seen before. Routinely speaking, when these guys go against one another, they just kind of fight. I mean, it's really just a fight in the city, and, you know, it goes on for a little while, and then innocents are put in danger. You know, Peter Parker defeats Dr. Octopus. Dr. Octopus goes away for a little while. He manages to break out, and then it starts all over again. It's pretty par for the course. You can set your watch to the fights between Peter Parker and his rogues gallery. But what this does is it introduces a new dynamic, because what they're doing is they're fighting inside the mind of Peter Parker's body. And so what this does is it creates a pretty even playing field between the two of them. Peter Parker basically draws on all the people who have served significant roles in his life, Uncle Ben, Aunt May, friends and family, different things like that. And while this does allow him to get a little bit of the upper hand, it is Dan Slott saying a little bit, hey, look, the most important thing that we have in life are friends and family. But the other half of this equation is that Dr. Octopus himself is not without his own friends. Now, when I say friends of Dr. Octopus, when I say family of Dr. Octopus, I use that term loosely. These various villains that Ock has fought behind or fought beside over the course of the years, I wouldn't really consider to be like legitimate friends or legitimate family, not by any stretch of the imagination, but they're the closest thing he has. Not only that, all these guys are formidable in their own right. And so in truth, it comes down to a pretty significant battle between the two of them, but in the end, Dr. Octopus ends up winning out. Now, the reason why this is the case is twofold. The first is that it is people with superpowers going against individuals without superpowers. But this is also Dan Slott offering a meta commentary that the people fighting on behalf of Peter Parker are only as strong as Peter Parker is for himself. That is to say, they're a reflection of the faith that Peter Parker has in himself. Only if he's a strong individual, only if he legitimately believes that he should be Spider-Man, do these individuals have any measure of power to combat Dr. Octopus. But in the end, he doesn't think that he deserves to be Spider-Man. And the reason why is because of a conversation between the two of them. As this fight starts to dwindle down and it just turns into Superior Spider-Man versus the Amazing Spider-Man, Dr. Octopus makes an incredibly good point. What happened here was that when Superior Spider-Man was in the process of getting ready to perform the surgery on that young girl, Peter Parker did not want him to do it. He kept making his hand shake. And the reason why was because Peter Parker did not believe that Dr. Octopus would have the skill to save this young girl's life. What Dr. Octopus says here is, you were willing to let this girl die in order to get your body back. You were willing to sacrifice an innocent in order to defeat me. Dr. Octopus making the case that what Peter Parker did was tantamount to Dr. Octopus holding someone hostage and then Peter Parker shooting the hostage in order to kill Dr. Octopus. That's the case that's being made here. And because of that, in face of that, Peter Parker has a total breakdown. He says, oh my God, you're right. I was willing to sacrifice the life of an innocent young girl in order to make sure that you were defeated, that you were stopped. The other half of this was that Dr. Octopus says, look, I was trying to do the right thing. So not only were you willing to put an innocent in danger, you were going to stop me from doing something good. You were going to become a bad guy because you didn't like what it was that I was doing. You didn't trust me. And so because of this, Dr. Octopus basically initiates this mind wipe. Peter Parker has no more defense, really nothing to put up against this. And so all these different memories of Peter Parker start getting wiped away. And what this does is it sets the next stage, the next phase of the story, which is simply Dr. Octopus in the body of Peter Parker without having to worry about his essence or his memories causing any kind of problems for him in the foreseeable future. Okay, so continuing on with Superior Spider-Man, we're officially into the story without Peter Parker, and it's actually kind of cool here. I mean, Peter Parker's cool and everything, but the idea of doing a story where Dr. Octopus takes over the body of Peter Parker is something that I'd like to see focused on strictly as him without influence from Peter Parker. And Dan Slott gives us that. I mean, this first issue is actually called Independence Day, because he's basically free of the control of Peter Parker, or at least the influence of Peter Parker. Now, the cool thing about this is it allows Dan Slott to set the stage for everything in all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man. Because remember, you have Superior Spider-Man, the whole run, 33 issues, you've got Spider-Verse, and which Spider-Verse wasn't really necessary. It's kind of a cool story, but it's not really necessary by any standard of measurement. It's almost completely and totally self-contained. And then you have 2 story arcs from Amazing Spider-Man, and then all new, all different Marvel happens. So again, it's pretty cool in terms of how all this just segues directly into the current run of Amazing Spider-Man under Dan Slott, Clone Conspiracy, and all that kind of good stuff. But what this does is it shows us how streamlined Doc Ock has made Spider-Man's life. Remember, he's got all these little spider eyes that are walking around. Well, because of that, they literally keep an eye on New York and tell him everything that's happening. And so when he wakes up in the morning, he gets daily briefings on what's happening, what villains are fighting one another, which ones are worth their attention and which ones aren't. Now, the funny thing about this is Doc Ock talks about how in this circumstance, Peter Parker would have just thrown on the Spider-Man costume and would have just jumped into the fray. Because of this, he says, I'm not going to take that role. Instead, I'm going to let them deplete their ranks. I'm going to let them fight each other to the point that they can't fight anymore, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to take things over. It's classic Napoleon Bonaparte. That's really what it is. Napoleon Bonaparte was well known for that. Go into countries, start civil wars when they're at their weakest, conquer them. It's the smartest way to conduct yourself in terms of taking over a hostile entity. And that's exactly what he does here. He's like, look, if I want to defeat these guys, I could go in and just fight them all. But the problem is I may or may not win, and it would just be a waste of time. What I can do is just let them keep fighting each other until the point that their forces are to the point of exhaustion. when that happens, I'll go in and just take everybody over. And that's exactly what happens, exactly what he does. He goes in and of course attacks like Owlman, and a handful of others. But the other thing that I want to point out here is how strong Spider-Man is. When I was going through Spider-Man number 700, we were going through like, Dying Wish and Suicide Run and all those stories that led up to Superior Spider-Man. One of the things that I wanted to hold off on talking about was the idea of how strong Spider-Man is. Now, Sal over at Comic Pop has done several videos on my channel, which you'll find down in the description, where we run over Spider-Man stuff. And Sal is one of the foremost knowledgeable people about Spider-Man that I've ever met. It's literally his bread and butter. Like it's crazy how knowledgeable he is about Spider-Man. But historically speaking, there's been references to Peter Parker pulling his punches, but in Amazing Spider-Man number 700, Dr. Octopus confirmed that. And that's the significance of those kind of things in comic books. It's one thing for a character to say, I'm really powerful. It's another for other characters to say, yes, they are really powerful. To confirm it by virtue of another character gives it a little more substance. Now, again, it's just whatever the writers want it to be, and so take it for what it is. But the fact remains here that with Dr. Octopus fighting against Scorpion in Amazing Spider-Man number 700, he punched him in the jaw so hard that he knocked his jaw off. And that's when Dr. Octopus realized how strong Peter Parker is, and that as Spider-Man, he'd basically been pulling his punches the entire time. Now, the reason why that was significant is because what it means is going forward in this story, the stories before it, as part of Superior Spider-Man, is that Doc Ock had to recognize how easy it would be for him to kill foes. That's one of the first things that Peter Parker started to realize in the Ultimate Universe. It's the first thing he realized to his detriment when he killed a person. So because of this, it's really kind of cool to see it all unfold. But again, one of the other things going on behind the scenes here is the return of Norman Osborn, really as the Green Goblin. Now keep in mind, Norman Osborn has and always will be a Spider-Man villain, but he had a lot of really promotion and a lot of exposure to the larger comic book community in Marvel during the events of Dark Reign, when he became the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, I don't know what was going on behind the scenes. I haven't been able to find any interviews to verify, but I don't know anything going on behind the scenes in terms of whether or not this was all designed, the whole Dark Reign story was all designed to bolster the reputation of Norman Osborn so that when Goblin Nation happened, that it would be a lot more interesting. I don't really know if that's the case or not. The only thing that I can really guess here is that because of the fact that Norman Osborn is essentially going to claim himself as the Goblin King, I guess really as part of lead up to Goblin Nation, that it was just really part of a scheme to kind of reinvigorate his character. But again, this could entirely be self-contained too. It could just be that Dan Slott didn't care anything about Dark Reign, and they just said, you know what, we're going to revamp Norman Osborn and we're going to make him the Goblin King instead of the Green Goblin. I have no real idea here, but the fact remains that switching back over to Doc Ock as Spider-Man, again, a lot of this deals with him and his personal relationships, and it's actually funny watching him talk to people because of the fact that he usually just talks down to them, and it's not like, I don't think it's funny to talk down to people, but it's funny in terms of how he does it, in the sense that he's talking to the professor, the professor for his thesis, and he's like, man, this guy's a buffoon, and he talks to him that way. Like, he literally finishes his test, takes it over, hands it in, and says, don't bother worrying about it, I aced the whole thing. You don't have to check it, but you can if you want, but if you did, you'd just be wasting your time. So it's funny to kind of see him interacting that way. But again, with regards to Goblin King bolstering his ranks, he's basically grabbing all these different individuals, these different henchmen, part of these small-time criminals or just petty thieves or what have you, and having them operate as part of his scheme in order to essentially try to take over New York. Now again, a lot of this is leading up to Goblin Nation, so it's just these pages here and there, where some small things happen with regards to the Green Goblins. But what ends up happening here is some of these goblins attack Mary Jane Watson's nightclub. This whole attack coincides with dinner that Spider-Man is having with Anna Maria. Now remember, Anna Maria is part of All New, All Different Marvel. She's a woman of a diminutive size, but she's also really interesting. And the reason why is because with her being as intelligent as she is, she doesn't really cook using conventional methods. And in fact, what she's doing is she's making a carbonated sorbet using dry ice. But it's really cool because they're basically making ice cream. Now, of course, this is great in and of itself because ice cream is an anytime meal. Like, you can have ice cream anytime. That's one of the great things that I love about ice cream. My personal favorite is cookies and cream. I want to know what your personal favorite is. I love cookies and cream. Pralines and cream isn't bad. Chocolate chip ice cream is terrible. Chocolate chip mint is even worse, but I love cookies and cream. But what this does is it sets the stage for a romance between the two of them. And the reason why is because when the dry ice is dropped, of course, Spider-Man reaches in, grabs it, and then just kind of lets it go, realizing, that it hurts him. But Anna Maria kind of patches him up, and the two of them share a kiss. Now, this is cool because with the character of Anna Maria, what she's going to do is begin the process of transitioning Dr. Octopus away from being a bad guy. And in fact, almost the entirety of his motivation with regards to, All New, All Different Marvel and all that stuff is going to be rooted in his love for Anna Maria. So that's the coolest thing about it. That's one of the things that I really dig about that. But again, it's also Dan Slott messing with the idea of Mary Jane Watson finding love love of her own when the entire incident with the attack on her nightclub, the resulting fire and so on, is met by the fire department, and she comes across a guy named Pedro. So again, Dan Slott's kind of toying with this notion of the two of them going their own separate ways. I mean, it's already established at this point by virtue of the things that he's written into the story that, Superior Spider-Man and Mary Jane Watson are never going to get together. But the other half of this is, again, the way that the entire Spider-Man process has been streamlined. The fire department showing up at Mary Jane Watson's business came by way of Superior Spider-Man because of the fact that he's aware of everything that's been going on with the city. In his mind, he was arguing, well, why not have my own life and keep the city safe? And that's exactly what he did. When the attack happened, when the fire broke out, he basically had the fire department notified and they responded. Now, of course, the bigger question to ask here is, what would Peter Parker have done? And Peter Parker would have arrived, he would have left Anna Maria, he would have arrived on the scene. And the reason why is because he wouldn't know whether or not people were going to die in the fire. And that's one of the issues with regards to Superior Spider-Man in terms of how he views himself as Spider-Man. I mean, it's no secret by now, he's a much darker character. And because of his willingness to kill, something that we'll actually see yet again here in this story, in his mind, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So sure, one person might die in that fire, but if 7 people are saved, well, then that's just the way it goes. And so again, it's kind of a darker road to take for his character, but it's one of the reasons that I kind of find a little refreshing here. I mean, Peter Parker Spider-Man is the Spider-Man, it'll always be that way. But for me, Dr. Octopus as Superior Spider-Man makes it a little more interesting, makes it a little more, a little more visceral in terms of how somebody with his mind would operate in a position like that. Now, of course, at this point, we transition over to J. Jonah Jameson with the execution of Spider Slayer. Now, keep in mind, we talked about this when we first started Spider-Man big time, and we had Spider Slayer, Alistair Smythe, who again had basically attacked Spider-Man, but it resulted in the death of Marla Jameson, J. Jonah Jameson's wife. And so because of this, Alistair Smythe is getting ready to undergo execution, but the call to Spider-Man comes by way of the fact that J. Jonah Jameson believes that Smythe is going to have some contingency plan in place in order to allow him to break free. Now, of course, all of this is taking place on the Raft, which is a maximum security prison for supervillains. Really, like the Raft had its biggest claim to fame when Electro engineered a mass breakout at the start of New Avengers when Brian Michael Bendis first took over the title. Really, when the title was first launched, to be honest. I mean, it was this inaugural story, The Raft, which was really, really cool. And then after that, it was Who is the Century? Like, New Avengers was really good for a little while, and then it just kind of dropped off, but it was pretty solid, in the beginning. But the fact remains here that the relationships between Superior Spider-Man and all the other people that he knows are predicated on how he views himself in relation to them. And so there's a lot of arrogance. There's a lot of, not really cruelty, but there's a lot of the belief that he's simply better than they are just by virtue of his intelligence. Now, the other half of this is that this is Dr. Octopus in the body of Peter Parker, which means that with Alistair Smith getting ready to undergo his execution, that basically his little spider slayer bots immediately infiltrate the place and start ripping things up. But Dr. Octopus was ready for it all. And that's why I say I think he's better than Peter Parker, because Peter Parker basically flies by the seat of his pants as Spider-Man. Now, for Peter Parker fans, that's the endearing part of it. That's the reason why they love him. It's because of the fact that you never know what's going to happen. He doesn't even know what's going to happen. He's quick on his toes. He has to think fast. He jumps into a situation, uses his intelligence combined with his spider sense and his abilities in order to try to get the situation to bend to his favor. With Dr. Octopus, it's a lot more methodical. It's a lot more planning. But I would say it's also a much better implementation of Spider-Man. I mean, let's say, for example, that Peter Parker took the steps that Superior Spider-Man did, where he basically had spider bots all throughout the city. Imagine how much safer New York would be with Peter Parker using that method. But of course, again, Superior Spider-Man was the one that came up with it to basically streamline the process. Now, in truth, this was really Dan Slott. I mean, as we kind of continue through this fight, this was really Dan Slott basically saying, hey, look, this is the basis behind what we'll see in all new, all different Marvel. This Spider-Man process was streamlined because Superior Spider-Man made it so. And so what it meant was that when Peter Parker finally got his body back, he benefited from all the work of Superior Spider-Man. So that's one of the reasons why it's so cool. But again, Doc Ock basically cuts off almost every single route of escape for Alistair Smith. But the other half of this is that with Superior Spider-Man having, destroyed the jaw of Scorpion, having fought off against guys, like Vulture and so on, what this does is it sets the stage for them gaining their own revenge. And it's basically this idea that his own ghosts are coming back to haunt him. Now, this is really just kind of, Dan Slott throwing this in there for the sake of having it in there. It's not bad. It's just kind of cool to see, but it's really more of a message about consequence. It's more of a message about the fact that whenever it is that Doc Ock goes through and acts as Superior Spider-Man and acts more aggressive, there will be fallback. There will be splashover. There will be consequences for his actions. And so, of course, the cool thing about this is that, one of the bots basically appears to like Nora Winters, who works at the Daily Bugle, J. Jonah Jameson, most of these individuals who were there to observe the execution and have since just kind of watched everything go awry. And Superior Spider-Man shows up with a pre-recorded message essentially saying, look, I've planned for this. I figured this was going to happen. I'm going to create a bubble that's going to keep you protected. Do not leave or you will put yourself in danger, which of course J. Jonah Jameson leaves because it's J. Jonah Jameson. But I would also say this is probably one of the best moments of his character. And the reason why is because with Superior Spider-Man and Alistair Smythe fighting one another, basically J. Jonah Jameson shows up in a guard's outfit and manages to offer a distraction. But of course, in the meantime, we really have Spider-Man dealing with Scorpion and dealing with Vulture and so on, and he's able to hold off his own. He's able to do pretty well. But then we also have Doc Connors being freed from his cell when Alistair Smythe takes power down to the facility. Now, keep in mind, we talked about Doc Connors. I mean, historically speaking, Lizard's always just been a villain of Spider-Man. He was driven more by like impulse and instinct and, his desire to kill Spider-Man more so than anything else. But we had talked during, really during big time in the events leading up to Superior Spider-Man that Doc Connors, the Connors persona, had basically taken over. It had been quite some time since he was the notable villain that we'd all known, the guy who just kind of ripped things up. Instead, he was very much himself. And so where he would be freed and we would think he would join in the fray against Superior Spider-Man, he actually doesn't. Instead, he basically fights as a good guy because it is Doc Connors fighting, with the Doc Connors mind. And so because of this, in the mind of Superior Spider-Man, Alistair Smythe represents just incorrigibility. The fact that Smythe will not stop until he kills J. Jonah Jameson basically continues his campaign of eliminating everybody that he simply just doesn't like or that has harmed him in some form or fashion. And so where we end up having Scorpion attempting to attack J. Jonah Jameson, we end up having Doc Connors jump into the fray. Now, this was actually really, really cool to see. And the reason why was because when it comes to the different foes of Spider-Man, Spider-Man has some of the most recognizable villains in comic book. Comic Pop made a really good point about that during an episode of the Weekly Pull about how Spider-Man has some of the most notable villains in the realm of comic books. I mean, I would say that like Dr. Octopus, Scorpion, Venom, Carnage, those are some of the most popular villains to have ever appeared. I mean, you have guys like Lex Luthor, and Darkseid, who are always going to be, at the very, very top. You've got guys like the Joker, who is at the very top. If you look at almost every single list of the most popular villains to have ever existed, but Spider-Man always has a very popular rogues gallery. The difference here is this is not Peter Parker facing off against these guys. This is Dr. Octopus. But to have Doc Connors allying himself with J. Jonah Jameson fighting against the Scorpion, it's a cool thing. It's actually a really interesting turn of events to see. And so because of this, essentially Doc Connors overpowers Scorpion in the extreme. I mean, there's really no contest here. He absolutely wrecks him. And the reason why is because it's just so much organic strength in Lizard himself. And so it's really kind of a funny situation to see. But the fact remains here, jumping back over to Superior Spider-Man, because of the fact that these bots are essentially being made to fail because they're being engineered and being shut down, what it means is that the various abilities of these, different guys are effectively going away. Vulture's going back to being a blind guy, so on and so forth. They're not nearly as capable as they were a second ago. So again, with everything effectively having come to an end, with them all having been defeated, Alistair Smythe makes one last ditch effort to try to destroy Superior Spider-Man. But in truth, he's fighting on fumes. I mean, he's really got nothing left. And so Superior Spider-Man essentially takes him out and kills him. And he basically says, look, where Alistair Smythe intended to basically switch bodies with Superior Spider-Man in the same way that Dr. Octopus switched bodies with Peter Parker, Doc Ock says, no, that's the first thing that any villain facing off against me would try to do is take over my body if they have any measure of intelligence. He says, I planned for that. But then what he also does is in his dying moments, Superior Spider-Man reveals that he's actually Doc Ock to Alistair Smythe. And so again, basically bringing his body back up and essentially saying this guy's dead, he's not going to bother us anymore. What he does is on the way back to the island, Superior Spider-Man reveals to J. Jonah Jameson that he had recorded a conversation between the two of them. And in this conversation, J. Jonah Jameson had stated, look, Alistair Smythe was supposed to be here for his execution. I want you to make sure that happens. When Superior Spider-Man asked the question, are you asking me to kill Alistair Smythe? J. Jonah Jameson more or less said, yes. And so because of the fact that this conversation was recorded, what ends up happening is Superior Spider-Man says, you're the mayor of New York. You're going to give me the raft. You're going to shut it down and you're going to give it to me. If you don't, I'm going to issue this broadcast out to the world. And everybody is going to see that the mayor of New York City, J. Jonah Jameson, had sanctioned the murder of a villain. And so again, this basically kind of sets things back to familiarity in the sense that J. Jonah Jameson is like, I hate you again, Spider-Man. I hate you now. I absolutely despise you now. Like you're a terrible thing. But the reason why Superior Spider-Man did this is because of the fact that with the raft simply having its doors closed and him taking over, it doesn't give J. Jonah Jameson or anybody any time to take out everything that's in there. And so essentially you have Superior Spider-Man with access to military grade technology and weapons. And so again, what it does is it allows him to up the ante in terms of his role as Spider-Man and move things in the direction of taking even more of a militaristic approach than he previously has in the story so far. Okay, so continuing our whole thing about Superior Spider-Man, this is when we actually delve into, really Spider-Man 2099. Now, here's going to be the kicker to this whole thing. Here's going to be the craziness, is like the middle of this story, there's going to be like a singular moment that takes place in this story, and it's going to be one panel and then another panel. Between those two panels, the entirety of Spider-Verse takes place. And it's kind of crazy the way that Dan Slott did it, but it was still really, really cool, and we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But what we do here is we actually pick up with Nueva York, which is basically New York in the year 2099. But what I want to do here is I want to have a little bit of a discussion about Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099. Now, this version of 2099 that we're seeing here is not the traditional Spider-Man 2099 universe. Instead, that's actually referred to as Earth 928. And remember, whenever it comes to futures in Marvel Comics, let's say, 20 years from now or 100 years from now or something like that, those are usually always considered to be like, alternate realities. They're usually always considered to be like dystopian futures or something like that, or sometimes they're enlightened futures. But because of the fact that that future is not guaranteed, Marvel just kind of chalks it up to an alternate reality. Now, aspects of that future may be guaranteed, but the future in and of itself, in terms of how we see it, is not guaranteed to happen. With 2099, traditionally, that is to say the, Spider-Man 2099, 1992 Peter David run, what had basically happened is that there was a massive civil war between humans and mutants, and eventually it led to the point where the Earth basically experienced this systemic breakdown of social classes, in the sense that you basically just had the super rich and then everybody else. And so what it did is it basically created a very corporatized environment where there was non-stop advertising, everything was corporate, it was 100% if you weren't rich, you were basically poor and you were living your life as best you could. The idea here was that at the time, because of the fact that heroes like Spider-Man were really kind of considered to be archaic, they were reminiscent of days gone by, Miguel O'Hara had actually become part of a group called Alchemax. And the idea was that Miguel O'Hara himself looked to the idea of Spider-Man and then eventually took up the mantle. Now, this coincided with like a new generation of superheroes who basically began rising up, but adopted the mantle of previous people, whether they were villains or anti-heroes. And so you had like Punisher 2099, and you had, all these different characters that we knew and loved, but as 2099 counterparts. Now, truth be told, I've thought about going back and covering Spider-Man 2099. I thought about going back and covering all that stuff. I mean, right now we can't, just because we have so much to do. Like, we have all this Spider-Man, then Spider-Verse, and then, all different amazing Spider-Man, and then we transition over to Thor, then we transition over to the entire Marvel cosmology and the origin of Thanos and the remastering of Infinity Gauntlet and then Infinity War and Infinity Crusade and a million things that we're gonna do, really going in for the next little while. But I may try to find a place to squeeze in Spider-Man 2099, because Miguel is a really, really cool character. I really love what he brings to the superhero landscape. But the fact remains here that we really just kind of join him in the aftermath of the Age of Ultron. And that's where the future that we're seeing right now, that's where that hails from. One of the big questions a lot of people had is like, how did Galactus from like the main Marvel universe cross over into the Ultimate Universe? What was going on with the Ultimate Universe during the collapse of the multiverse, all that kind of stuff. So to kind of sidetrack here for a second, away from this Spider-Man story, and bear with me here because we're gonna jump back into it. When Marvel was basically setting the stage for the collapse of the multiverse and basically going into Hickman's whole Avengers and New Avengers and all that kind of stuff, they had this great big huge series, like a lot of these series of events that were designed for the purpose of basically wrapping things up, or at the very least allowing Marvel to segue into stories that would basically lead up to the collapse of the multiverse. Original Sin was one of the most notable, in the sense that Original Sin showed that Nick Fury had killed the Watcher, but in terms of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, it showed that Captain America was previously part of the Illuminati and then basically was ousted because he didn't agree with the idea of destroying worlds that were going to crash into the main Marvel universe and destroy them both. And so because of that, the Illuminati kicked him out and wiped his memory. And so it created all these really cool stories and things like that. And we'll cross that bridge when we go through our whole following Thanos throughout the history of Marvel's cosmology, all of his stories and everything, going into the remastering of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers. But the fact remains here that in terms of the Age of Ultron story, what that did is it basically had Wolverine travel back in time and then kill Hank Pym, only to travel back in time a second time and stop himself from killing Hank Pym. And so because of the fact that the story was in and of itself crazy in terms of time travel, what Brian Michael Bendis and Marvel did is they said there's been too many instances on too many occasions in Marvel Comics when people have traveled back in time to try to fix things. The time is not some linear construct. Time is effectively a living organism. And so by virtue of Wolverine going back in time so many times, he basically broke time itself. That's a lot of times that we're throwing out there. He essentially broke time itself. And so what it did is it sent ripples, it sent shockwaves throughout the entirety of the Marvel multiverse, which set in motion a lot of things and really helped to contribute to the collapse of the multiverse. But in terms of this, getting back into the Spider-Man, in terms of this future as we see it right now, we don't know exactly what it was that happened. All we know is that the conclusion of Age of Ultron had ripple effects throughout the entire multiverse, and it somehow affected this particular universe. Now, the idea here seems to be that, again, kind of picking up with Miguel, it's really just Dan Slott showing us, here's what Spider-Man is about. Here's what Spider-Man 2099 does. He's a futuristic version of Spider-Man. His suit's a little more durable. It's got special little goodies that separate him. And that's really the way it goes in the realm of the Spider-Man landscape. Whether it's Miles Morales in the Ultimate Universe, whether it is, Peter Parker with the Iron Spider armor, whether it's Miguel O'Hara, whether it's Kane, almost said Bill O'Reilly, whether it's Ben Reilly, whatever the case may be, it's basically just all these different versions of Spider-Man have something that make them different, something that make them a little unique, their suits or their powers or so on and so forth. And so because of this, what ends up happening here is, of course, Miguel is basically just kind of saving the day. But the reason why is because of the fact that, again, this Age of Ultron ripple event has basically caused a massive catastrophe in the city in terms of the time stream being all screwed up. Now, a lot of this is stemming from Alchemax itself, Alchemax being the mega corporation that basically runs the show. It's almost like a futuristic version of, Roxxon Oil or something like that in the main Marvel universe, where Roxxon is an extremely corrupt organization that has its hands in all different kinds of politics and behind the scenes, some very shady things, assassinations of public officials, different things like that. Alchemax is very much like that in the future, but it's one of these things where it kind of represents the corrupted nature of, corporations and capitalism and so on and so forth. There's a lot of political themes that went into the original Spider-Man 2099 line of stories, but the fact remains here that within the realm of Alchemax, Tyler Stone is really kind of the guy running the whole situation. But Tyler Stone is the son of Tiberius Stone. And in fact, Miguel O'Hara himself is the son of Tyler Stone. And so because of this, Miguel O'Hara and his father are really in a kind of a battle, like this eternal battle of good and evil, so to speak, in the sense that they fight each other. But what makes the situation a little more dynamic is it would be like if Bruce Wayne became Batman and Thomas Wayne, his father, became the Joker. Like they're just kind of at odds against one another, and they will be until the end of time. The issue here is that because of the actions of Wolverine during Age of Ultron, something in the past was screwed up. Something in the past went wrong. And so the idea is that Tyler Stone's effectively disappearing from the time stream. Now, what's really cool about this is the way that Dan Slott does it. Under normal circumstances, when we think of the grandfather paradox, which is to say, if you went back in time and you met your grandfather as a child and accidentally killed him, then you would cease to exist. Traditionally, we just have you just kind of break down on the atomic level. You simply just phase out of existence because you couldn't exist in the first place if your grandfather was killed. But the reason why it's called a grandfather paradox is if your grandfather died before you could be born, then how could you have gone back in time in the first place? So again, it creates all kinds of weird situations. But the way Dan Slott does it here is it basically gives us a chance. It basically gives them time to correct the problem in the sense that instead of Tyler Stone just vanishing out of thin air, Tyler Stone's basically just sort of disappearing. And so what it tells us is that in the past, there's a sequence of events. There's, the first event, then the second event, then the third event. And we're probably on the second at the moment, which means that the closer these events get to the point where, Tiberius Stone, the father of Tyler Stone, vanishes, then the closer we get to Tyler Stone disappearing in his entirety. And so because of this, Miguel's basically tasked with the idea of saving the father of Tyler Stone. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because on the surface, Miguel's like, look, you're my mortal enemy. Like, there's no reason for me to save you. If you die, the world will be a better place. Well, the issue with this is then we start invoking hypothetical scenarios, hypothetical possibilities. The world exists as it does now in, the 2099 universe because a series of events took place that led it to where it is. Whether or not it's a huge event, whether or not it's a small event, Tyler Stone was born. If Tyler Stone was never born, what would the world look like if Alchemax never came to power? It might be better. It could be worse. And so because of this, because of the fact that there's no telling what the future may hold, we end up actually finding out that Miguel traveling into the past is guaranteed. And the reason why is because they show an image of him in the past. And so this basically means that he's going to jump back into the year 2013 and try to figure out what happened that set all these events in motion in the first place. Now, what we end up doing is we actually jump back to, again, Peter Parker, Superior Spider-Man, and it's really kind of a cool moment here in the sense that he's playing baseball and he smashes the ball out of the park. And that's kind of what we would expect, right? Like Peter Parker playing baseball. Like, I'd never play baseball against Peter Parker. Like, I don't care how fast you can throw the ball. He's going to smash it, and then everybody's fun is going to be ruined. And so because of that, because we don't like people ruining other people's fun, I would not play against Peter Parker. But the cool thing here is that this entire situation is being monitored by Tiberius Stone. So again, we're back here in the present with the father of Tyler Stone, Tiberius himself. And so because of this, what this really means is that Tiberius is basically engineering the fall of Horizon Labs. Now remember, Horizon Labs is the organization that's basically founded by Max Modell. It's a giant think tank. It's designed to basically grab some of the bright young members of society and have them create inventions and different things like that that will make society better. It's very similar to like Hickman's Future Foundation under Reed Richards, and that's par for the course, right? I mean, in Marvel Comics, and it's, even in DC Comics, you don't have like one organization that represents one thing. Like, you don't have like one government-sanctioned superhero team. You don't have one, think tank. All different kinds of people have different kinds of think tanks. Reed Richards has a Future Foundation, which is some of the world's smartest kids that he's allowed in there. Max Modell has Horizon Labs. We'll see Parker Industries begin to take form over the course of this story. You see a lot of different organizations and groups that serve the same purpose, but they're basically just led by different people. Now, it doesn't mean they're at odds. It's not like Max Modell is like, I hate Reed Richards and his Future Foundation. I'm gonna get those evil kids. I mean, it's nothing like that. It's nothing as silly and sinister as that, but it just serves the purpose of kind of reminding us there's a much bigger world in the realm of corporations and companies and so on and so forth. But the reason why Tiberius Stone is so significant here is because of the fact that what Tiberius Stone has been doing, or at least what he's done, is he's basically set the stage for Horizon Labs to essentially go under, for Max Modell himself to be arrested due to the fact that the different experiments that he's been working on have basically come into light as being illegal, in the sense that he's tampering with time, the sense that he basically tried to make, or at least one of the people there tried to make a knockoff of vibranium and ultimately screwed it up, created reverbium instead, different things like that. Now, Max Modell wasn't the one who invented these things, but it's a classic example that if you're at work and you screw up, if somebody higher than your boss sees it, it makes your boss look bad because your boss is in charge of you. And so because of that, Max Modell is basically the one taking the fall here because he's the one who's in charge of Horizon Labs. He's responsible for all the different experiments that his employees are working on at the moment. Now, at this point, we're basically kind of reminded by Dan Slott that Goblin Nation is still going on, which is to say Norman Osborn is still making his own Green Goblin army. This isn't wildly significant here. It's just kind of a little small reminder, but it's Dan Slott basically saying, keep in the back of your head, guys, Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, basically found a way to hack into Superior Spider-Man's little spider bots in order to keep all the goblins in New York hidden away from those bots. They won't know the goblins are there, they won't detect them, and they won't report back. And so because of that, it's basically Dan Slott reminding us that Superior Spider-Man is completely unaware of the fact that Green Goblin is building an army for himself within the city of New York. Now, at this point, we transition over to Alchem. And Alchem is basically just the predecessor to Alchemax. But the idea here is that Alchem has basically taken over Horizon Labs, or is it really kind of initiating a hostile takeover. Now, this is basically short for Alan Chemical, but because of the fact that the head of Horizon Labs, Max Modell, is being taken away, essentially what happened here is again, by nature of it being a hostile takeover, Alan Chemical has bought controlling stake in Horizon Labs. And that's why it's considered to be a hostile takeover, because basically when you have publicly traded companies, the people who have a majority hold in the company have a lot more authority than those who don't. With Alan Chemical holding the majority shares of Horizon Labs, this now means that Alan Chemical owns Horizon Labs. And so they can dissolve the company, they can absorb the company, they can do any number of things that they want. Now, of course, Superior Spider-Man is very much aware that Tiberius Stone seems to have a hand in this, as is most everybody else, just because of the fact that Tiberius is on with Alan Chemical, and it's like, hey, look, guys, we'll keep you around, if we're interested, if we choose to. But it's really Superior Spider-Man kind of chasing them down with the intent intention of tracking these guys down. Now, at this point, we actually pick up with Grady. Remember, Grady's one of the members of Horizon Labs, and Grady basically came to the idea that in his mind, Tiberius Stone had set in motion these events, which is to say, he believes the Tiberius Stone had sabotaged these different experiments, which is the reason why they had gone awry, and it's the reason for why Max Modell's being arrested in the first place. So the intention of Grady is to travel back in time and to simply witness what it is that Tiberius Stone is doing. Now, this is the inherent difference between what it is that Dan Slott's doing in this story and what we would see in traditional time travel stories. In traditional stories where time travel is invoked, time travel in and of itself is just a way out. It's a way for a writer to get themselves out of a hole. They write this incredibly amazing story and it's super, super good, but then they don't know how to end it. Well, then suddenly here comes Doctor Strange, and Doctor Strange whisks them away to the future, and then everything's okay. It's one of those things that fans absolutely hate because it's a lazy way to end a story. What Dan Slott does here is he doesn't use time travel to end a story, he uses time travel to further a story. And that's where fans don't really have any problem with it. You know, fans are like, hey, look, if it's a means to an end, which is to say it's a tool to be used in order to give us an organic ending to a story, then that's fine. Then that works. And so what ends up happening here is Grady basically just kind of jumps back and starts looking through different points. Now, before Grady can actually enter this device, Miguel O'Hara suddenly jumps through. And again, this really kind of feeds into the idea of Miguel being here in the sense that, you know, the guys at Alchemax in the year 2099 sent him through this portal because it was a two-way street. It was going to be opened up. It was basically Grady opening the door. And then they knew, at least at Alchemax, they knew this door would be opened at this particular time and it would allow Miguel to jump through. And so because of this, Miguel's basically a man on a mission. His idea is trying to figure out what it is that's taking place that's leading to the death of Tyler Stone in the year 2099, why it is that Tyler Stone is disappearing from existence. And so with Superior Spider-Man catching up to Tiberius Stone and the intention of killing him, the funny thing here is that Tiberius is like, well, you know, you can't harm me. I mean, you know, you're Spider-Man, you don't kill people. I'm following within the confines of the law. What I'm doing is legal. Yeah, it's really crummy and yeah, it's really shady, but you can't hurt me, right? And this really kind of goes back to the discussion that we had about injustice. You know, free will gives people the freedom to do anything they want to, but it also gives them the freedom to deal with the consequences. The consequences may not be legal. The consequences may just be that you piss somebody off really bad and they're gonna kill you. That's the consequence of the things that you said and the things that you did. That's what's going on here with Tiberius. He basically pissed off Superior Spider-Man by screwing him over and screwing over the entirety of Horizon Labs. Now, the other half of this is Dan Slott furthering this idea that Dr. Octopus in the body of Peter Parker is becoming a good guy, because under normal circumstances, we wouldn't have seen Dr. Octopus do this. Dr. Octopus would have been like, well, I mean, you know, I'll look at the entire situation, get a lay of the land, and if it works in my benefit, I'll let it happen. If it doesn't, then I'll stop it. But then I'll try to find some way to make sure that I come out on top here. Superior Spider-Man is being altruistic in this situation. What Tiberius Stone is doing is wrong. Horizon Labs is a great organization. Max Modell is a legit guy. Superior Spider-Man is basically going to try to kill Tiberius Stone because he's a dick, he doesn't deserve to live, and Horizon Labs is going to continue on exonerated of the crimes that it's been falsely accused of. So that's kind of the cool thing here, is this is altruistic Spider-Man. Now, the funny thing about this too is that Doc Ock has never met Spider-Man 2099. He doesn't know who Miguel O'Hara is. And this is Dan Slott kind of harkening back to the death, quote unquote, of Peter Parker when Superior Spider-Man basically purged all of Peter Parker's legitimate memories from his mind. The issue here is that when Miguel O'Hara first shows up, Peter Parker's met Miguel before. They've been a team. They've teamed up on a multitude of occasions. Miguel knows who Spider-Man is. He knows Spider-Man is Peter Parker, but Dr. Octopus doesn't know this. And so in his mind, this is just a guy who looks like Spider-Man. He doesn't know where he's from. He doesn't know what he's about. And so Miguel kind of initially greets him as a friend. Superior Spider-Man greets him as an enemy. And so what this does is lead to a fight between the two. Now, in terms of Miguel, he's basically trying to solve this problem. He's trying to figure out what's going on. And so in a lot of ways, what he's doing here is he's looking at Spider-Man and saying, I don't know what happened to you. I don't know what's been done to you, but you've become more extreme. And if I have to put you down in order to preserve the future, that's exactly what I'll do. Now, at this point, we also have Tyler Stone in the future communicating with, Miguel O'Hara. And this is when Tyler basically says, hey, look, that Spider-Man referenced that guy as Tiberius Stone. That's my father. And so if he dies, I will cease to exist. That's the issue here. Tiberius Stone, somewhere along the line, was killed. And so because of the fact that he was killed, my entire existence is coming to an end, as will yours. And so again, this is Dan Slott kind of meddling around with time a little bit, kind of messing with time itself. But again, it still kind of works. At this point, Miguel O'Hara's role is solidified. We now know exactly what it is that he's doing here. His job is to preserve the life of Tiberius Stone. And the reason why this matters is because of the fact that there is a segment, and there will be a section coming up when Miguel doesn't know if he should. He's like, maybe I should just sacrifice my life. life and make the future better. You know, I'll let Tiberius Stone die or I'll kill him myself. Tyler Stone will cease to exist and then I will cease to exist. But at the end of the day, it'll all still work out because the future will be a better place, or at least I hope it will be. And so in the midst of all this, we pick up with Grady. And again, Grady jumping through here, you know, kind of going back in time, it's not wildly significant. All it really does is just confirm the fact that Tiberius Stone was messing around and sabotaging these different experiments that had gone wrong at Horizon Labs. And so we don't really need to go super in-depth into that. I mean, that's really the extent of what we would be discussing anyway. I think kind of the main focus here should be on Miguel and Superior Spider-Man. And so the conflict, the battle between the two of them is actually really interesting, is actually really cool in the sense that they're both relatively evenly matched, but Spider-Man 2099 has tech at his disposal. And that's one of the differences here, but that's also something that Dan Slott's kind of hearkening on. Because of the fact that Dr. Octopus took over the body of Peter Parker, in Miguel O'Hara's future, Superior Spider-Man is a part of the Spider-Man mythos. It'll be chalked up to the idea that Spider-Man became really, really extreme for a little while, but the different tools that Doc Ock used in terms of his time as Spider-Man, his enhancements to the suit, all of that falls into the different studies that Miguel O'Hara has done on Spider-Man. And so whether Miguel O'Hara knows it or not, his role as Spider-Man 2099 is influenced by the things that Doc Ock has done as Superior Spider-Man. And so again, it's really kind of interesting to sort of see them meet and to see how one influences the other. But with Tiberius Stone having the ability to basically disrupt Spider-Man's spider sense, of course, what this does is it allows Miguel O'Hara to take off with Tiberius Stone. And of course, you know, following this, it's basically Superior Spider-Man trying to track him down and trying to figure out what's going on. Now, this is the segment when Miguel begins to question whether or not he's doing the right thing. He sits down and he basically says, look, you know, if I let Tiberius Stone die, then that means that he'll never have Tyler Stone, which means Tyler Stone will never have me. I'll cease to exist, but Alchemax will never become what it is. Tiberius Stone will not be able to lay the groundwork for Alchemax. Tyler Stone will never be able to build on that groundwork, and the world will not be as crappy as it is. But the funny thing about this is that Miguel O'Hara is not taking into account the realm of possibilities. You know, in a free market system, if Microsoft fails, somebody will take their place. If Apple fails, somebody will take their place. God willing, Ubisoft fails, somebody will take their place. Because of this, what this means is that, you know, Miguel O'Hara could very well be trading one devil for another. And in this situation, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And so because of this, he could be making a much worse future. And that's something that he contemplates. He says, look, I don't know what the future would be like. If I cease to exist, if Alchemax ceased to exist, who knows how the future could turn out? I mean, who knows if Alchemax could basically be restructured 100 years from now, and it leads Earth into this utopian era. And if I kill Tiberius Stone, that utopian era never comes into existence because people never see Alchemax. They never come to the conclusion, we need something better than that. We can have a better society for ourselves. He's like, I could make things worse in the long run. And so because of that, he ultimately says, look, I have to let him live. And so with this in mind, Tiberius Stone kind of has, you know, upper hand. He has the upper hand here because of the fact that he jumps off the building. He's like, I guarantee you're going to save me. And so he jumps off the building. Spider-Man 2099 saves his life. And so it's almost guaranteed that his future is set in stone. And so because of this, with this story intending to lead into Spider-Verse, and with the Superior Spider-Man run designed to sort of wrap things up and bring things winding down, what ends up happening here is Superior Spider-Man eventually catches up with Miguel O'Hara. Now, the funny thing here, this is actually kind of a hilarious moment, Miguel realizing what it is that's going on, realizing that all of reality is basically at the threat of destruction simply because of the fact that one of the experiments Tiberius Stone had messed with was an experiment dealing with time, which in turn would basically lead to the destruction of all things because all the energy being emitted by this time travel device can't be contained. Miguel O'Hara shows up on the scene with Tiberius Stone and says, look guys, everything's beginning to go awry, everything's beginning to go insane. The only way for us to fix this is to follow my lead. And the reason why is because, you know, Miguel O'Hara is like, look, I come from a future where this happened, and I know that what you guys are going to try to do is fail, but I know the way to fix this problem. And so the issue here is that while he's on the verge, once he says, look, you know, all we have to do is this thing, Superior Spider-Man shows up out of nowhere and knocks him out. And it's a funny moment because then everybody's just like, dude, what did you do? We're like 15 minutes away from the destruction of the world and the universe itself. Why did you knock out the one guy who could save us? Now, the reason why I say this leads into Spider-Verse is because of the fact that with Miguel O'Hara knocked out, it now falls onto Superior Spider-Man to take the lead here. The issue is that, again, with him wiping the memories of Peter Parker, he doesn't know how to solve this problem. And the reason why is because of the fact that when the original vibranium experiment by Sajani Joffrey went awry, and Peter Parker, as his normal self, basically began manipulating energy in order to contain the energy that was let off, contain the explosion and the destruction of Horizon Labs, Superior Spider-Man purged that memory. And so he doesn't know what Peter Parker did in order to keep that a massive amount of energy from totally collapsing in on itself. And that's what this is. This is basically a much larger version of the energy let off by Sajani Joffrey's attempts to make vibranium. Remember, we had talked about how, at least during that story, we had talked about how Dr. Doom invading Wakanda, basically taking vibranium, had led to Black Panther rendering all vibranium across the world inert, which in turn led to Sajani Joffrey trying to make artificial vibranium. It had all sort of led up to this moment when Peter Parker's intelligence was being demonstrated. Now, Superior Spider-Man doesn't know what to do, and so he's basically on the verge of being seen as a complete and total fraud. He's on the verge of being seen as a guy who doesn't know what he's doing, who's basically making things up along the way. And so because of this, with this massive time device on the verge of completely and totally, obliterating everything, what happens is Superior Spider-Man tells everybody to leave. He starts meddling with the device, trying to find a way to fix it, and then the entirety of Horizon Labs just vanishes up in thin air, totally disappears. Now, because of the fact that Tiberius Stone was saved by Miguel O'Hara, what this means is that Tiberius Stone is now safe. Or I guess it means that Tyler Stone in the future is still alive, and the future is guaranteed. Now, this was the moment that Tyler Stone was talking about. In this moment right now, things went a different way. We don't know exactly what way things had normally gone in, but what seems to have been the case is that in this scenario, Superior Spider-Man at some point along the line did not tell them to leave. And so the result was that they were all basically yanked through the time stream, and Tiberius Stone was presumably killed somewhere, during that time frame, and it led to the destruction of everything, or it led to the death of Tyler Stone, or the presumed, death of Tyler Stone, which would have led to this, led to the death of Miguel O'Hara, hence the entire situation why Miguel is here in the first place. But in this moment when Superior Spider-Man basically vanishes, and in the moment that he reappears on the street, the entirety of Spider-Verse took place. That being said, we are going to discuss the whole Spider-Verse event. The issue here is that with the whole Spider-Verse event, it's not an easy thing to sort out. There's actually a lot of lead up in terms of like Morlun and in terms of Ezekiel and the other storyline and, the Clone Saga and all different kinds of things. There's all kinds of stuff that goes on there. But the fact remains here that again, Dan Slott's sort of wrapping things up, bringing things to a close. And one of the things that he wraps up pretty fast is the idea of Mary Jane Watson. Mary Jane Watson had been trying to get a hold of Superior Spider-Man this entire time, and he was basically getting annoyed with her, saying, look, she needs to move on. Like, she needs to get her life together. She needs to move on, get another guy. She's hung up on me. It's a problem. Well, of course, when he finally calls her back, she basically says, look, I've been hung up on you. It's time for me to move on. I have no romantic interest in you anymore. And so it's basically Dan Slott saying, hey, look, these two guys are never going to get together. These two guys are never going to be anything significant to one another. Now, from this point going forward, what this does is it basically picks up with the aftermath of Spider-Verse, and it picks up with Superior Spider-Man ramping things up extremely fast to basically make a better life for Peter Parker. And that's kind of the funny thing here. At the same time, it's also him trying to make sure that he stays Superior Spider-Man, and we'll cross that bridge once we get to it with the Spider-Verse line of stories. But from this point, what we're going to do is we're actually going to stop Superior Spider-Man, and we're going to jump back, and we're going to start covering the Superior, the Spider-Verse stuff. So we're going to jump back to some of the older stories of Amazing Spider-Man, and then pick up into Spider-Verse. Hopefully that way we have everything covered in order to make it all make sense. And then once Spider-Verse is done, we'll jump back here to Superior Spider-Man. It's the best way I know how to do it in order to make sure that we fall into the chronology of the Amazing Spider-Man, because that's what all this is. I mean, this is all designed for the purpose so that when the Spider-Man movie comes out and people are searching for Spider-Man content everywhere, they can pick up with these videos and chronologically go through everything about the Spider-Man mythology and learn everything there is to learn in terms of Dan Slott's run with Big Time going forward, going into all new, all different Marvel. So earlier today, I was reading Silver Surfer Against the Tide, and I really want to cover Hickman's like Avengers, New Avengers, Infinity, all that stuff like right now. For those of you guys who remember that really old Silver Surfer video that I did that had that amazing monologue, that was from the opening part of Against the Tide, like the first 20 pages or something like that. It's one of those Marvel Infinite comics, so it's like 80 pages long, but technically in terms of like it being a complete comic, it's only like 20 something pages long, but it's designed for digital release, and it's designed to be read on tablets and stuff like that. So, it makes it a little more interesting in terms of how it all works. It's actually really cool when you go through and start reading them on tablets. Like they're really, really interesting. But the fact remains here that we will not get to Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers or anything like that until we do the Thanos stuff, and that comes after Thor, which comes after this Superior Spider-Man. So in the previous video, I had mentioned that we were going to stop Superior Spider-Man and we were going to jump into Spider-Verse, but we're only 2 videos away from finishing Superior Spider-Man. And so it doesn't really make any sense to kind of stop and then come back and make 2 videos. Instead, what we'll do is we'll cover Spider-Verse and we'll just kind of jump back to Spider-Verse in the beginning and just say all this takes place between like everything that we talk about from like, you know, X video, from like that video up until the end of Spider-Verse, all takes place at this point between Superior Spider-Man, and we'll just call it a day. I think that'll be pretty easy. It'll be a lot easier to follow that way than it will be, you know, any other way in terms of, you know, doing anything kind of crazy. But the fact remains here that with this particular video, we're going to be basically getting Superior Venom. We're going to be getting Superior Spider-Man with the Venom symbiote, and it actually works out pretty well. It's a really interesting concept. But what Dan Slott does here is he actually rolls over Agent Venom into this whole thing. Now, when we talked about Lee Price Venom from Marvel Now 2.0, we had talked about how that was basically the evolution, really the end of the Venom symbiote's run in terms of giving the Venom symbiote character and giving it evolution and kind of evolving it over the course of Marvel's publication history. And so it really made sense. But what this is going to show us is the idea that Flash Thompson believes that he understands the symbiote. So it's kind of the early days of growing it and evolving it and showing us that it actually does have sentience and where it goes and that kind of a thing. So it's pretty cool. But again, this little bit of a segment with Agent Venom is pretty short. It's really just Dan Slott saying, hey, look, I mean, it's only a couple pages, but it's really Dan Slott saying, hey, look, you know, Agent Venom is going to be facing off against Superior Spider-Man. So that was kind of the cool thing, because the further we got into this, the more it was like him fighting different people. So it'll be like in this video, it'll be Superior Spider-Man versus Agent Venom, and then Superior Venom versus the Avengers. So it's kind of cool. It's interesting in terms of them fighting one another. But at this point, we jump over to Superior Spider-Man proper, and we basically join him with the unveiling of Parker Industries. Now, again, this is the early days of Parker Industries before it becomes the major conglomerate that it is right now, in all new, all different Marvels. So we have people like Sajani Joffrey who have been brought on board, Anna Marconi who's been brought on board. Now, of course, Aunt May and J. Jonah Jameson Sr. are basically the silent investors. They're the ones that were kind of throwing money towards Peter Parker and letting him be a part of it all. But at the same time, we also have like Cardiac, you know, Elias Wortham being part of the whole Parker Industries team. Of course, Cardiac basically being a guy who is more or less a vigilante, but was doing it for the purpose of helping people, basically stealing medical equipment, things like that, in order to provide healthcare for people who just simply couldn't afford it on their own. So again, it's really cool to see these little bits and pieces begin to come together, and these little bobs and bits sort of, you know, create a more cohesive story from the stuff that we've all ran over so far, even going as far back as Spider-Man Big Time. And of course, that's really why it was necessary, because it's all just one gigantic story. And even once we progress, when we get into all new, all different Marvel, when we cover Spider-Verse, different things like that, it'll all just continue to be one part of a major cohesive story. So again, with the idea of Anna Marconi, one of the greatest things about this is that Dan Slott was basically using her as a way to essentially turn Superior Spider-Man around, to make him a good guy, to give him a reason to be a good guy. Now, again, it's also Doc Ock, so Doc Ock is still somewhat nefarious, and he's still willing to commit murder. But at the end of the day, it's all basically a case of the ends justifying the means, which he's not entirely wrong about. I think he's a little heavy-handed in terms of how he deals with criminals, but the fact remains, if you kill a guy for committing a crime, he won't repeat that crime because he's dead. So again, it's kind of interesting in terms of cleaning up the streets of New York and keeping things pretty straightforward. But again, this also basically coincides with the arrival of Superior Spider-Man facing off against Agent Venom. And the reason why is because of the return of a villain named Crime Master. Now, this is not the original Crime Master, and in fact, this is basically just a nobody. But Crime Master is an alias that has previously been used. And what we are going to find out here is that this is all basically being done by a guy named Roderick Kingsley. Now, we'll get to him here in a little bit, but for right now, the fight between Superior Spider-Man and Agent Venom is actually pretty cool, just because of the fact that they're familiar with one another, or at least Agent Venom's familiar with Spider-Man in terms of the hero and Peter Parker. The problem is that this is not Peter Parker. And again, that's one of the crazy things, is because people who have known Peter, or people who have known Spider-Man, are used to him, you know, acting a certain way. But here, he's murderous, and he shows the idea that he's going to kill Agent Venom with fire, you know, and destroy the Venom symbiote in the process. Now, again, this is also Dan Slott basically building on the whole Agent Venom concept, in the sense that Flash Thompson knows the Venom symbiote, or believes he understands the Venom symbiote better than anybody else. Now, in terms of it actually talking to people, that's not really happening yet. Instead, it's more or less Flash talking to the Venom symbiote and keeping it under control. So again, it's all really just kind of growing it and evolving it and so on and so forth. But it's also this idea that the Venom symbiote will do whatever it needs to do to keep itself alive. It will avoid weaknesses, different things like that. So of course, where the conflict is pretty short-lived, the reason for this is because of the fact that basically Agent Venom Flash Thompson bolts out and then uses the Venom symbiote to essentially shapeshift and keep anybody from being able to realize who he is or what's going on. And so at this point, we sort of jump over to Carly Cooper. Now remember, Carly Cooper is the ex-girlfriend of Peter Parker and knows that he's Spider-Man. This is the revelation that was basically given to us by Dan Slott following the Spider Island event, because of the fact that Manhattan saw all these different people getting Spider-Man abilities, but Peter Parker was the only one who was familiar with them, just going through and using modicum of intelligence, Carly Cooper basically deduced the fact that Peter Parker was Spider-Man. And so because of this, with Spider-Man acting awry, with Spider-Man acting so starkly different, Carly Cooper's initial idea was, that's not Peter Parker. Somebody did something to him and is either mind controlling him or somehow took over his body. And so in the background of everything that's been going on, Carly Cooper's basically been investigating and trying to figure out who it is that's actually in control of Peter Parker. Now, where she's basically stumbled across information that all but guarantees that Dr. Octopus is the one that's pulling the strings here, that Doc Ock has taken over the body of Peter, she doesn't really know how deep things go. She just simply knows that Doc Ock is somehow involved in this. But in the midst of her investigations, she's basically captured by the Green Goblin's people. But the fact remains that she's brought before the Green Goblin, and his question is, who is Spider-Man? I want to know Spider-Man's real identity. Now, of course, Carly is just not willing to give that information out. It's really one of those things where she's like, I'll take it to the grave. I'll die before I tell you, which really kind of makes sense. But again, a lot of this sort of goes back and forth between, between Flash Thompson and, between Superior Spider-Man and Agent Venom. Now, keep in mind here, Flash Thompson does not have the use of his legs. The Venom symbiote is basically the one thing that allows him to be able to walk. And so because of that, the Venom symbiote really has to sort of exhaust itself, or exhaust its abilities more so than it normally would if it were like Peter Parker or somebody like that who could walk around on his own. But the fact remains here that in the eyes of Flash Thompson, because of the fact that Spider-Man is acting so completely different than what he's used to, the question is, what's going on here? Of course, is really just kind of looking and investigating and see if he can't figure it out on his own. Now, at the same time, while all this is going on, Miguel O'Hara is still around. Spider-Man 2099 is still there. Now, of course, he's operating under the guise of Michael O'Hara and basically pretending to be just a member of Alchem, more or less speaking to J. Jonah Jameson and so on and so forth. He's just kind of keeping an eye on things and doing what he can to make sure that Alchem does not become Alchemax in the year 2099. But again, it's just kind of Dan Slott showing us where we lie at the moment, where things are sort of sitting and how it all comes together. But in the midst of Flash Thompson basically receiving a treatment from Cardiac, from Elias Wortham, in terms of giving him artificial, prosthetics, providing him with artificial legs, Superior Spider-Man shows up for the purpose of intending to interrogate Flash Thompson. Now remember, the reason why is because of the fact that from the perspective of Superior Spider-Man, all he sees is Venom. Because remember, Doc Ock basically purged the memories of Peter Parker, so he does not recall anything about Flash Thompson, Agent Venom, knowing who he is, knowing he's a good guy. It's just in his mind, the Venom symbiote is bad, and the Venom symbiote has to be taken out along with whoever it is that's wielding it. And so because of that, using Sonics, Superior Spider-Man strips Flash Thompson of the Venom symbiote. Now again, this is basically kind of hearkening to the idea that Flash had it under control, that Flash understands the symbiote, that Flash was able to bond with it in a way that no one else can or no one else ever has. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people really, really love the idea of Agent Venom, because they look at Eddie Brock and they say, okay, look, the Venom symbiote and Eddie Brock go together really, really well, but it was only because of the fact that they shared a mutual hatred for Peter Parker. In terms of a beyond the surface, I genuinely understand the Venom symbiote, more or less concept, that's Flash Thompson. And people loved that about Flash Thompson, giving the Venom symbiote character, giving it drive, giving it ambition, giving Flash basically a larger role in the Marvel Universe outside of just the guy who was a dick to Peter Parker when he was younger and the guy who lost his legs in a wartime conflict. And so because of that, the Venom symbiote basically bonds itself directly to Spider-Man. Now again, because of the fact that we really don't have the Venom symbiote speaking, because it's not really talking to people, all really seems to happen here is a Venom symbiote recognizes Spider-Man and says, that's the guy that I originally wanted to be with, and that's the guy that I can be with again. And so we basically sort of have a superior Venom here, and it's actually kind of cool in terms of how he looks, because it's basically the mind of Dr. Octopus combined with the powers of the Venom symbiote. Now, the funny thing about this is that Dan Slott goes all the way back to the post 1984 Secret Wars Spider-Man landscape, in the sense that he basically just says, hey, look, Spider-Man as we knew him then, when he became a host for the Venom symbiote, was corrupted by it. He corrupted the Venom symbiote, the symbiote corrupted him. They basically became bad guys to a degree. Now, it wasn't a traditional bad guy. Spider-Man didn't go around, robbing banks or anything like that. But in terms of him in relation to the hero that we traditionally knew, they were starkly different. It was night and day. And so that seems to be what's really happening here. Superior Spider-Man is basically running amok with his new abilities, with the Venom symbiote being attached to him. And so it's really kind of cool to see this unfold, because we end up seeing him taking, really kind of cutting a swath through the superhero community more so than he had before, because now he has a new host of abilities at his disposal. And it's really Dan Slott kind of showing us, or kind of juxtaposing the abilities of Spider-Man with the abilities of Venom, but then turning around and taking the entire concept and turning it on its head when he asked the question, what happens when Dr. Octopus's mind in the body of Peter Parker gets the Venom symbiote? Then what happens? How crazy are things going to get? How's he going to use the abilities. Is it possible? Is it one of those things where Dr. Octopus can overcome the Venom symbiote, or will he be corrupted with power just like everybody else? And the answer here is that he's just like everybody else. He'll be corrupted by his power. He'll run amok with these new abilities that he has at his disposal. Now, in terms of our little section about Crime Master earlier in this video and Roderick Kingsley, what we end up finding out is that with Roderick Kingsley operating as the original Hobgoblin and more or less having been defeated on a multitude of occasions, Roderick Kingsley basically came to the realization that he could, in a sense, or he could really just kind of grab a lot of these D-list level villains, either villains that were small time and died or villains that were small time and walked away, grab their villainous identities and then use them and essentially sell them off. And that's what he's been doing. Of course, we know that that Ben Urich's son basically became, the new Hobgoblin. Phil Urich kind of maintained that role for a while before he joined the Green Goblin. We essentially have all these guys, Crime Master being another example. It's just small time villains that would never have received any attention before getting attention here. Now, in truth, this is a genius way to reintroduce small time guys. Now, it's not Dan Slott saying, hey, look guys, like, aren't you excited for the return of Crime Master? Not at all. We're not going to see Crime Master return and play any measure of a significant role, but we're going to see something kind of interesting in terms of the fact that we see these various identities showing up, these villains being used by Roderick Kingsley for his own ends, and then facing off against Spider-Man in different, different scenarios and different situations. Now, jumping back to Superior Spider-Man again, because of the fact that he's much where Peter Parker was post 1984 Secret Wars, he's basically brash, he's arrogant, more so than he was before. He's prone to lash out. He follows this exact same pattern of behavior that Peter Parker follows. Now, what's interesting about this is Mary Jane Watson does not initially pick up on this. It's just that in her mind, she's like, what's going on with you? Why are you acting so violent? Why are you being this way? Now, of course, once the Venom symbiote makes its presence known, then immediately she's like, oh my God, it's the same thing all over again. The Venom symbiote's taking control of Peter Parker. Now, in terms of how she deals with this, it's really just kind of like, okay, stay out of the way. Just because Mary Jane Watson is not at a point in any form or fashion where she could take it on, not to mention the shock of seeing the Venom symbiote again is startling to her. Now, of course, Dan Slott is going to use this as a way to basically segue things back into a state of normalcy. But because of the actions of Peter Parker, because of the things that he's done, because Mary Jane Watson looks at him as kind of beyond the ability to, to return to any measure of normalcy, at least in terms of what she is familiar with, she essentially calls in the Avengers. Now, this is actually a really cool situation. We don't really see like Daredevil hanging out and just being like, oh man, I'm in over my head, I'm gonna call the Avengers. Sal over at Comic Pop actually had a really good discussion once, and I can't reference the comic and he couldn't remember it either, but it was a really cool moment. I think it was Bullseye, but it was an instance where Daredevil had basically taken out Bullseye and the Avengers showed up and said, no, he's coming with us. And they just took Bullseye away from Daredevil. But we usually see the Avengers intervening only in times of like a huge situation or whenever it's convenient. For this particular scenario, the Avengers are called by Mary Jane Watson because she's like, look, the Venom symbiote's returned to Spider-Man. Now, in terms of what this means for the Spider-Man landscape, this is Dan Slott showing us how dangerous the Venom symbiote is, which is something that we knew about, but for the modern Spider-Man reader picking up after Big Time, they didn't know this. They'd read about it, a time or two, or maybe they'd heard people speaking about it. They knew about it through word of mouth, but in terms of witnessing it with their own eyes, they didn't really know off the top of their heads. Now, this is basically the new Avengers: Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, Wolverine, and so on. These are the new Avengers essentially coming together for the purpose of trying to take out the Venom symbiote. But the funny thing is that this is the Venom symbiote with the mind of Dr. Octopus in the body of Peter Parker, and it crushes the Avengers. Now, the funny thing about this is that it's not like Superior Venom has inside knowledge, because remember, Dr. Octopus wiped his mind of Peter Parker. And so because of that, with Peter Parker seemingly being purged, there's nothing here to indicate that Superior Venom has an upper hand on the Avengers. Instead, the indication here seems to be that he's just that damn powerful, that he's just that capable, he's just that wildly durable in terms of his strength, his agility, the different abilities that he can extend, beyond himself in order to take out the Avengers. So he's literally, it's a one-man army. Superior Venom is able to hold his own against Wolverine, Captain America, Black Widow, Thor, and Spider-Woman all at the same time. And that is an incredible feat in and of itself. So it's just kind of cool to see. But in the midst of all this, Tony Stark, of course, being the man behind all this, basically asked the question, do we know if that's Flash Thompson losing his mind, or is it legitimately Spider-Man? Now, of course, in order to get an answer to this, they basically run over to Parker Industries, and Tony Stark meets Flash Thompson, and this is when he realizes that is genuinely namely Spider-Man. And so of course, the question now becomes, what happened? Why is it that Flash Thompson has, temporarily lost the Venom symbiote? What in the world is going on here? And so again, this is basically Dan Slott kind of setting the seed, setting the stage for what will become the bigger picture in terms of Superior Spider-Man in relation to the Venom symbiote and the fallout of all this when Superior Spider-Man finally comes to an end. And so again, with this battle against the Avengers wrapping up relatively fast, we basically have Flash Thompson using the Iron Man suit to essentially show up here. Of course, Tony Stark lends it to him, says go to the battlefield, see if you can't talk some sense into the Venom symbiote. But the manifestation of the Venom symbiote's feelings and thoughts and emotions begin to arise when Flash arrives on the scene and the symbiote basically says, look, as Agent Venom, you use drugs to keep me subdued. We don't really work together organically. You basically keep me under control, chemicals and different things like that. And so because of this, this is the Venom symbiote at its most basic, essentially lashing out, going crazy, attacking the various Avengers. Now, of course, in response to this, Doc Ock basically regains himself and tries to expel the Venom symbiote, but really isn't able to do it on its own. Now, again, this is a return to familiarity. Keep in mind, Peter wasn't able to officially and finally cast off the Venom symbiote until he basically encountered Reed Richards, who told him what it was. Peter began to realize what was going on with the Venom symbiote, and it was only when he was at his absolute strongest that he was able to get rid of it. With regards to Dr. Octopus, he can't do it on its own. And so what ends up happening here is, out of nowhere, we basically end up having Peter Parker making his return. Now again, this is the consciousness of Peter. And what Dan Slott basically says is that this consciousness has basically been hidden away from Dr. Octopus ever since Dr. Octopus believed that he had basically wiped Peter away from his mind. So it's cool to kind of get this return. It's cool to kind of see this great moment show up, just because of the fact that, again, it's Dan Slott saying, hey, look guys, lest we forget, Peter Parker will make his return. So it's Dan Slott kind of beginning to wind down. It's Dan Slott beginning to sort of bring things to an end and say, okay, now we're going to go ahead and segue into the return of Peter Parker proper and the removal of Dr. Octopus from controlling the body of Peter. We're going to start moving in the direction of wrapping up Superior Spider-Man. And so again, because of all this, the Venom symbiote basically returns back to Flash Thompson, who calls it a day. And Peter Parker, again, more or less comments about how Dr. Octopus still doesn't realize that he's there, and he can more or less operate from the shadows, of his own mind, so to speak, and essentially stay hidden away from everything. Now again, because of the fact that this leads into Goblin Nation, this basically leads into the War of the Goblins, what we end up getting here is this sort of begins to wind down as things begin to wrap up relatively fast, is that we have Roderick Kingsley more or less coming face to face, so to speak, with the Green Goblin, in the sense they're basically communicating. But again, Roderick Kingsley has basically been building up his own army. He's been building up his own Hobgoblin army, so to speak, the various people that he's lent different technologies out to. But we also have the Green Goblin, who's been using the Goblin formula as well as just pretty underhanded tactics in order to create an army for himself. And the idea here is we're basically going to have these different Goblin armies going against one another, facing off. As this starts to wrap up, the question that's being asked here by Tony Stark is, what's going on with Spider-Man? Now, we know previously that when a sample was taken by the Avengers with regards, to Peter to analyze and see whether or not there was anything going on, if he was like a Skrull or something along those lines, they basically come to the conclusion that nobody had done anything to him. But Tony Stark basically makes the case that says, look, while we were off in space, we were off doing our own thing, we were analyzing, you guys were working with this, and that's fine, but I know this equipment better than anybody else. And when he starts to go through it, what he realizes is that somebody had tampered with the equipment. And when the question is asked who it was that tampered with the equipment to skew the results of Spider-Man, it turned out to be Spider-Man himself. And so again, this is basically all the roads leading to the idea that Superior Spider-Man is being tracked down by the Goblins and by the Avengers. Basically, the world is crumbling down around him. Okay. So we're really at the end of Superior Spider-Man. I mean, this is the last story, Goblin Nation. But one of the reasons, and something that I'm hoping you notice over the course of the story, one of the reasons why I wanted to do the Superior Spider-Man run is because what Dan Slott did with this was either include, kind of wrap in, or offer some retcons with regards to the creation of Alchemax, the company that exists that's the main enemy of Miguel O'Hara in Spider-Man 2099. And so, assuming that we go forward and start doing Spider-Man 2099 stuff, what I wanted this series to do is serve as somewhat of like an origin story for Alchemax. So that way we could just kind of jump into Spider-Man 2099 and not have to go bootstrap explanations and so on and so forth. We could focus on the story itself, with you guys being able to reference this material with regards to where Miguel O'Hara is coming from and how Alchemax came into existence. And that's really what a lot of this does. This is really Dan Slott kind of showing us the building of Alchemax in real time. Now, we'll get to what Alchemax is here in a little bit for those people who are new to the Spider-Man landscape, because because again, this is really all just kind of giving people an idea of what Spider-Man is about, especially with the release of the upcoming film, as well as just kind of passers-by who stumble across my channel and have an interest in Spider-Man. But this basically coincides with the Green Goblin Norman Osborn making his move on New York. And so essentially what's been happening here is he's been staging a series of small-time skirmishes, absorbing different aspects of the criminal underworld. And this really comes out of several different stories, some of which we need to know and have done, and some of which we don't really need to know and we can kind of gloss over. With regards to the stuff that we do need to know, it's pretty much everything we've covered in Superior Spider-Man so far. That Norman Osborn was basically working behind the scenes to make his triumphant return to conquer New York, that Carly Cooper, the former girlfriend of Peter Parker, had discovered that Dr. Octopus had swapped minds with Peter Parker and she kept it all recorded in a journal. But when she was kidnapped by the Green Goblin, once she was turned into a goblin using the formula, she basically handed the journal over to Norman, who in turn read it and discovered the fact that Peter Parker and Dr. Octopus had switched bodies. The other half of this is that in his attempt to basically streamline the role of being Spider-Man, Superior Spider-Man had essentially distributed all these different little spider robots around the city of New York, and on the whole, they worked. It would allow him to see everything that was going on. And so if there was a crime taking place like a mugging or something like that, he didn't need to intervene. All he had to do was just call the cops and the cops would respond. It allowed him to be virtually everywhere at once. But if it was a massive event, if it was some great big huge calamity that required his attention, he could leave whatever it was that he was doing and go to that particular incident. The downside to this is that Norman Osborn effectively grabbed one of his bots, managed to hack into it using kind of a subroutine, and then in turn reprogram the robots so they would never recognize anybody with a goblin face. And so they would basically treat them as though they didn't exist. And what it did is it allowed Norman Osborn to execute the second part of his plan. And the second part of his plan was to basically build a goblin army. Now, this was composed of several different things. The first of which was really the role of a guy named Roderick Kingsley. Roderick Kingsley, as we talked about before, was the original Hobgoblin. He was designed to be the new goblin that Spider-Man would go against following the death of the Green Goblin. Now, of course, that's how he was written, but the Green Goblin was just so wildly popular, Marvel had to bring him back. And so the result was that we kind of got Hobgoblin and Green Goblin, and they both served different roles, but they were both relatively popular in the realm of Marvel Comics. But Roderick Kingsley, having long since more or less abandoned the role of the Hobgoblin, essentially started taking all these different identities that belonged to small-time villains and then franchising them out, giving them to different criminals, allowing criminals to operate as those, under those bad guys' identities, commit crimes, so that nobody would know that it was actually those criminals. So for example, Phil Urich was operating as the Hobgoblin for most of this story. But because of the fact that the identity of the Hobgoblin is associated with Roderick Kingsley, Kingsley could remain in hiding, Phil Urich could be the Hobgoblin, and anybody who knew about the Hobgoblin would think that it was Roderick Kingsley and not Phil Urich. And so again, that's really how a lot of these identities, these villainous roles worked themselves out. At the same time, we also had the Hand, and that came out of a story called Shadowland, but essentially all that really dealt with was the idea that the Hand was being used by Kingpin to basically keep his thumb on the city of New York. The issue is that when Superior Spider-Man had basically invaded the Kingpin's base of operations, ran him out of New York, what was left of the Hand retreated to Norman Osborn and joined his goblin army. And so that's really how a lot of these things worked out. It was really just grabbing all these different plot threads and just kind of bringing them into one cohesive story. And so the result here is that we basically pick up with Hobgoblin making his move. Now, this coincides with the idea that Superior Spider-Man is trying to figure out how in the world it was that Hobgoblin managed to circumvent his programming. If Green Goblin is back, if Norman Osborn is there in the city of New York and Superior Spider-Man's spider bots did not pick up on his face, then the question is, why? And so this is when he basically goes and he visits a young kid by the name of Uatu Jackson. Now, Uatu Jackson was a member of Horizon Labs, and he was actually the person who had designed the facial recognition software of the spider bots, who would in turn catalog criminals in order for Superior Spider-Man to use their identities later on. If they ever were to commit crimes, he would know who they were. Again, part of the whole streamlined process. Now, of course, Uatu's not a bad guy here. I mean, he's not a villain. What we end up finding out is that he had basically used a database with regards to information that was being sent out and so on and so forth, tapping into existing databases. What the Green Goblin did was basically hijack this frequency and then reprogram the facial software. So the facial software would never see goblins. It would never identify them, and it would never basically report back that a goblin had been spotted. And so again, this creates kind of a weird situation, because what this does is it basically leads to Superior Spider-Man using an underground tunnel system that was formed by the Green Goblin himself to allow his guys to move back and forth throughout the city without being detected, to eventually locate their base of operations. Now, once he gets there, this presents a really funny situation, because we've never really seen an instance, this kind of scenario before. This has never taken place. And so what happens when the number 1 villain of Spider-Man meets the number 2 villain of Spider-Man? Will they team up? Will they, become enemies? Dan Slott gives us this really cool scenario, and what he basically says is they're going to be enemies, because keep in mind, while Dr. Octopus became Spider-Man, while he took over the body of Peter Parker and his goal was to become a bad guy, in the moments when their bodies are basically being swapped and Peter realized there was no way to regain his body back, he basically beseeched Dr. Octopus. Dr. Octopus experienced all the memories of Peter, and Peter said, look, there are people here that I care about, my Aunt May, I have a love for them, different things like that. You have to keep them safe. You cannot let them be harmed. And this really touched Dr. Octopus in the heart of who he was. And so what it ended up doing is it basically sent him on the path of being a good guy, leading him up to this point. And so where Green Goblin only sees Dr. Octopus and recognizes him as one of Spider-Man's most notable villains, in truth, Doc Ock is a good guy now. And so with the two of them kind of going against each other, it really kind of creates a funny scenario, because what we end up finding out here is that Superior Spider-Man is not actually here. Instead, it's more of a hologram. But at the same time, Norman Osborn knows how to play this game. Norman Osborn is extremely smart. And what happened is that in the midst of this meeting, Osborn was tracing the signal of Superior Spider-Man back to his base of operations on Spider Island. So again, it's kind of cool because it's basically both of them have their own methods, their own levels of intelligence. Now, what this does is this brings into fruition the idea of the Goblin formula. Now, the Goblin formula in and of itself is really one of multiple instances when Marvel kind of hit home at the idea that everybody was trying to duplicate the super soldier serum of Steve Rogers. And in fact, we'll cover this, or we'll talk about this once we get into Iron Man Extremis, because Future Farm was trying to copy the super soldier serum and come up with Extremis instead. But the fact remains here that the Goblin formula was designed to basically enhance the various attributes of the person who uses it. The problem is that it also breaks their sanity. So they literally lose their minds, or at least Norman Osborn ended up losing his mind. Now, for the most part, different people have been affected with it different ways. For example, there was a girl by the name of Lily Hollister who was actually dating Norman Osborn for a little while and stumbled across the Goblin formula. The difference is that when she ingested it, or when it basically bonded to her skin, that she can switch out of being a goblin at will. She's not bound to losing her sanity. She doesn't lose her mind. She can just kind of switch back and forth how she wants to. So different people have been affected different ways. Now, if enough time passes, they'll just be gone in their entirety. Who they were before will vanish and they'll just be left as a goblin. But for the moment, for her character, things function a little bit differently. Now, from here, we basically switch back to the mindscape of Peter Parker. Now, again, this is something that we've talked about, time and time again, just because of the fact that within the realm of Superior Spider-Man, Dr. Octopus had realized that the mind of Peter Parker was still there because of the fact that Peter Parker's consciousness was tied directly to his memories. And so where Doc Ock had basically purged the memories of Peter Parker, ideally, it had purged Peter Parker in his entirety. The issue with this is that when Doc Ock had basically recalled on memories of Peter in order to help him navigate Peter's life, that is to say, the memories of Peter's romance with Mary Jane Watson, or when Aunt May asks something that Dr. Octopus didn't know the answer to, and he researched the memories of Peter Parker in order to give her an answer, what it did is it basically made these memories a core part of Dr. Octopus. And so Peter Parker's consciousness remained alive. There's only about 30 memories that are there, but so long as any facet of Peter's memories are alive, his life force, his essence, are tied to those. And so because of the fact that Octopus referenced those memories, Peter Parker's essentially alive through him. The issue is that Doc Ock could still purge Peter in his entirety. And so what happened is Peter basically began jumping through Dr. Octopus's own memories. And what this was is it was Dan Slott essentially giving us a scenario where each guy learns about the other. Dr. Octopus learns about the life of Peter Parker by being Peter Parker. Peter Parker learns about the life of Dr. Octopus by jumping into his own memories. And what he sees is a mother who is extremely aggressive in terms of showing affection, which is to say she keeps him smothered, so on and so forth. He has a father who's extremely abusive. He's picked on by kids at school because he's socially awkward. All this time and time again, Doc Ock has been met with nothing but absolute oppression and just being given a hard time by everybody. And so that guy grew up with a really bad life. And what this did is it allowed Peter Parker to understand why Doc Ock is a bad guy, to understand where he's coming from and why he's done the things that he's done. It's just been in pursuit of some measure of acceptability, or at the very least, trying to control his own life. And so with Norman Osborn making his move across the city of New York, the response of Mayor J. Jonah Jameson is to basically reactivate the Spider Slayer protocol that was created by Alistair Smythe, but in turn modify this protocol so that the various members of the anti-Spider Force, as it was formed by Jameson, would be retrofitted with these new suits and be allowed to carry out their goal of basically clearing out New York of the goblins themselves and essentially restoring order. Now, the reason why I say this is basically the formation of Alchemax is because of the fact that, remember, Liz Allen had basically taken Allen Chemical, Alchem, and then merged it with Oscorp for the purpose of creating Alchemax. Now, of course, we know about the time-displaced Spider-Man 2099. That was covered in the last video, or really the video before the last video. But what this is doing is basically saying, this is how Alchemax comes into existence. This is how Alchemax forms. It's basically a merger between Oscorp and Allen Chemical. Now, in terms of what role Norman Osborn has in this, we'll actually find out as we get further into this story. But the fact remains here that with regards to Peter Parker himself, with regards to Superior Spider-Man acting as Peter Parker, what this does is it really just kind of begins to show us the struggle that he saw in relation, or at least Peter saw in relation to Doc Ock, in the sense that when Doc Ock first became Dr. Octopus, when he underwent the experiment that basically bonded the tentacles to his body, he in turn saw himself as somebody who could finally get some respect, some guy who could finally be treated, as the genius that he knew he was. Now, of course, this is going to lead into the crushing experience of facing off against Peter Parker, and that's when things are really going to kind of go awry. But it's also going to be the reason why Doc Octopus hated Peter Parker so much, because he was essentially the one guy that just showed up and stood in his way, and he was a representation of a lot of the other issues that he had. But again, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. The fact remains here that with regards to really Carly Cooper, as one of the goblins invading Parker Industries and going after Sajani Joffrey and, Superior Spider-Man himself, what we end up finding out is that where Carly Cooper was previously taken and turned into a goblin, she's not completely transformed yet. Instead, there's still some measure of her there. So while her physical body's changed, her mind is somewhat intact. But this is what we were talking about when we were saying that eventually a time will come when who a person was will vanish in their entirety. And that's exactly what takes place here. With her as a person, she still has her mind intact, and she tells, Superior Spider-Man, you have to make a cure for this, otherwise I will be gone, and Norman Osborn, Green Goblin, will spread this formula across the city of New York, and everybody will be gone. And so again, it creates kind of this ticking time clock, so to speak. Now, with regards to this formula, while he is working on it, while Superior Spider-Man is putting it together, ultimately he has to bail out. And the reason why is because of the fact that Green Goblin has essentially, after learning that Superior Spider-Man is Dr. Octopus, waged a one-man war against him. And so this is really going to kind of serve as a distraction. And the reason why is because of the fact that we're basically going to have two conflicts going on in this story at the same time. We're going to have Green Goblin versus Superior Spider-Man, and then we're going to have everybody else, the Avengers and so on, going against the forces of the Green Goblin. So it's kind of like a two-stage conflict. Now, this is Green Goblin playing two different games. And the reason why is because of the fact that while he is crazy, while he is out of his mind, it's going to basically make it difficult for Superior Spider-Man to actually create a cure for the Goblin formula. It's going to make it difficult for him to save the ones that he cares about because he's torn. Either it's the city of New York or it's the individuals in his life. And if he has to make a choice between which person will he choose? Now, of course, in this instance, we also have a couple people who are more or less lost, people who basically end up dying in the conflict. But the interesting thing about this is that, again, Superior Spider-Man had established himself as a guy who wasn't really concerned about casualties. Unless they were wildly significant, unless they were important, then it was just collateral damage. That's just the price you pay when it comes to war. Some folks live and some folks die, and that's just the way it goes. Now, that was basically Dan Slott differentiating him from Peter Parker. And in fact, we'll find out just how different these two are and what the major failing is of Superior Spider-Man at this point. But from here, we again have these Spider Slayers, as they're controlled by Jameson and the police and so on, engaging Superior Spider-Man with the intention of taking him out. Now, the reason why is because of the fact that they look at Superior Spider-Man and they believe that he's in league with the Green Goblin. And the reason why is because what they do is they look at his track record. Keep in mind, he's defeated every major criminal in the city of New York. The only person left is the Green Goblin. So the person on the outside looking in, it would almost look like Superior Spider-Man was clearing out the competition to make way for the Green Goblin. He was basically working on behalf of Goblin to make the city easier to conquer. That's the initial indication that's been received by Jameson and the police and so on and so forth. And so where Miguel O'Hara does jump in, and Miguel O'Hara tries to basically help, and again, really kind of allow Superior Spider-Man to stay captured for the purpose of gaining answers, ultimately, these robots are hijacked by Norman Osborn. And so again, what this shows us is that whether we knew it or not, Osborn is tied into Alchemax. Alchemax. He is involved in the creation of these robots and does have a back door in how to access them. And so again, switching back to the mindscape of Peter Parker, this entire scenario is really intriguing because when it shows us Peter directly, what it gives us are all these different conflicts with Dr. Octopus. And of course, what we end up finding out is that in the mind of Doc Ock, every time he was defeated by Peter Parker, it was yet another instance of his father saying, you're never going to be anything. It was another academic professor saying, you're dumb. It's another instance of kids who are basically saying, get out of here, you're not one of us, you're weird. It was all the different defeats that Doc Ock had faced over the course of his life manifested in the form of a singular guy named Spider-Man. And so because of that, the hatred that he had for Spider-Man just stretched the absolute limits, because it was like Spider-Man represented every instance in which Doc Ock had met some kind of a roadblock over the course of his life. And so with that in mind, we essentially have Peter Parker trying to find a way back to his own body. At the same time that all this is happening, again, one of the things that Dan Slott does that I really enjoyed is basically bringing in the Avengers, because on the surface with a story like this, where the whole of New York is being attacked, a lot of writers would not include ancillary teams. I mean, Bendis has done that on a multitude of occasions. They don't show the Avengers, they don't show anybody like that or any other superheroes. It's just this one guy. And we're somehow expected to believe that the entire city of New York is being attacked, and this one hero is the only one who knows about it, or the only one who cares enough to do anything about it. And so the cool thing about this is like Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, Black Widow, Wolverine, Spider-Woman, the new Avengers, they're all responding. They're all, doing what they can to help keep New York safe. Now, the way they're depicted is within the charter of the Avengers themselves. The Avengers are a peacekeeping force. They'll fight if they have to, but with the city of New York right now, the one behind all this is the Green Goblin. And so their job is to take down whatever enemies are there, specifically the forces of the Green Goblin and these different, these different Spider Slayer robots that have been co-opted, and at the same time, try to save as many people as they can. So again, it's not wildly important. It's just kind of cool to see this a little bit of a story brought in, this little bit of the events included in this conflict. But the fact remains here that with Peter Parker navigating this mindscape and basically jumping back through the memories of Dr. Octopus and really kind of retroactively retracing his steps, what he basically does is he accesses the mind of Dr. Octopus, accesses the mind of his younger self, and in turn gives birth to all these memories again. And so basically he's able to tap into everything that makes him who he was. Now, the reason why this matters is because of the fact that Menace, of course, one of the henchmen of the Green Goblin and several others, have created these traps around the city of New York. One of them is a young girl named Amy Chen. Now, of course, Amy Chen is one of the kids that Superior Spider-Man had helped along the way, recovering from an illness, but the idea is that she's basically being strapped in a subway station and she's going to be hit by a subway train. Now, this is where the huge difference between Peter Parker and Superior Spider-Man comes into play. Superior Spider-Man is analyzing the scenario. Remember, he's trying to trace and trying to locate Anna Marconi and save her life. That's his girlfriend. That's the woman that he's romantically interested in. Along the way, there's this girl named Amy Chen. He cannot do both. He cannot save Anna Maria Marconi and Amy Chen, or at least it doesn't seem to be the case. And so where he's paralyzed with indecision, Peter Parker manifests suddenly and says, you have to jump. You have to go. And this is when we basically get the return of Peter Parker. And the reason why is because Peter says, look, your brain, your intelligence is a gift in a lot of different ways. The things that you do, the things that you've been able to pull off, or at least how you look at things. Of course, again, Peter doesn't know a lot of what's been going on, but he says, the things that you've done here are good in terms of how you function. The problem is when you have no time to think, you act. When you have time to think, then you take that time. But you can't be paused, or you can't be paralyzed by indecision because you're trying to make the right choice. And so in the end, Dr. Octopus basically realizes that Peter had been navigating his mind. And so the indication seems to be here that he let him basically access his own memories. But the fact remains that Dr. Octopus and Peter essentially reconcile. Dr. Octopus says, look, the biggest issue that I had is that sure, I was arrogant, but it was because of the fact that I was trying to overcompensate. It's because of the fact that I knew I was not as smart as you are, but I wanted to pretend that I was. And so Peter Parker is really kind of speechless throughout this whole thing, is because it's Dr. Octopus spilling his guts out to Peter, basically saying, you are a better Spider-Man than I will ever be, because when it comes to self-sacrifice, you do it without a second thought, but I can't bring myself to do that. And so again, it's really kind of this cool thing thing because it's like this journey, really in some ways a journey of Peter Parker, in the sense that it's almost like, you don't know what you have until it's gone. And so it's like Dan Slott basically saying, okay, let's take Peter Parker as we know him out of the equation with Spider-Man. Let's put somebody else in his stead, and then let's see how these stories unfold. Once we get to the end, let's compare the two and see how they stack up against one another. And so ultimately, what Doc Ock basically does is travel back to Parker Industries. Of course, Peter Parker being totally surprised by the fact that there is a Parker Industries, but they travel back to the building and Peter Parker regains his memories. He goes back to his normal self. And what we get is this amazing thing, because we have Peter Parker back to himself, back in his own body. He gets rid of the Superior Spider-Man suit. He puts on his Amazing Spider-Man suit and he says, "My turn." And it's so cool. It's one of the coolest things. I was reading this and I was like, oh my God, like Peter Parker's back. Amazing Spider-Man is back. And it's one of the coolest things to happen, because as soon as Peter Parker regains control of his own body, remember, he has no idea what's been going on with like Parker Industries, what's been going on with Horizon Labs. He has no idea what's been happening there. Instead, all he knows is that he's just back now. So, I mean, Carly Cooper being turned into a goblin, he didn't know about that. The launch of Parker Industries, so Johnny Joffrey and Anna Maria Marconi working for the company, he didn't know about that. So as soon as he shows up, he just starts getting screamed at by people. They're just like, why have you been gone all this time? And carrying on, because of the fact that, again, Superior Spider-Man had basically taken off. He had made Parker Industries and then vanished from the company for like a month. He had abandoned Miguel O'Hara to face off against all these different Spider Slayer robots. And then when he shows back up again, Miguel O'Hara kind of freaks out on him. Now, again, this is really kind of cool because the two of them, of course, end up teaming up, and Peter Parker jumps back into the conflict alongside the rest of the Avengers and really kind of making up for the things that Superior Spider-Man did, where Superior Spider-Man quit the Avengers, Peter Parker rejoins, different things like that. Now, of course, when we end up getting into the direct conflict between the Green Goblin, along the way, Peter Parker had basically been doing things like injecting Menace with the cure for the Goblin formula, which basically turns her back into turns her back to normal again. They've been doing this almost every step of the way. But with the conflict between Peter and Norman Osborn, basically on the rooftop alongside Anna Maria Marconi, Green Goblin learns that Peter Parker's back because of the fact that Green Goblin makes a joke about how Green Goblin makes a joke about how he's going to destroy everything that Spider-Man loves. And Spider-Man says, well, the only thing that I'm left with is the dignity of knowing that I never carried a man purse. So despite the fact that with Spider-Man giving Green Goblin shit about his satchel, that's how he knows that Peter Parker's back. It's amazing. I absolutely love this part of the story. It's one of the coolest things. But again, it's really kind of refreshing to see Peter Parker back, because with his character, what it does is it creates urgency and it creates struggle and it creates strife, because Peter Parker saves everyone, right? Like no one dies whenever it is that Peter Parker's around, if at all possible. With Superior Spider-Man, the storytelling had to be a little bit different because he'll kill bad guys. We've seen that. He's just like, we're going to kill him and then we're going to be done with it and they won't come back. That's that. But when Peter Parker is in a scenario where he has to save Anna Maria Marconi and he has to defeat the Green Goblin while going without letting Green Goblin die, basically saving his life, then it makes things difficult and it makes things hard. Now, in terms of the whole idea with Alchemax, we end up having this situation where we basically learn that Norman Osborn had his face changed. That what he did is he took on the name of a guy named Mason Banks and he began operating as a de facto investor on behalf of Osborn Industries. And so because of that, I guess on Oscorp rather. And so because of that, what he did is he turned around and invested alongside Liz Allen, which in turn allowed for the merger of Oscorp and Alcorp to create Alchemax. And so again, this is really kind of a funny scenario, because what ends up happening here is Peter Parker basically turns the robots, these little goblin bots, against Mason Banks himself, which really just kind of leaves him incapacitated slightly, or enough that he's lost his goblin abilities because of the injection that Peter Parker gave him, basically curing him of the goblin formula. But in saving Anna Maria Marconi, he also saves, Norman Osborn with a different face at the same time. And so again, what this does is kind of wrap things up, because Norman Osborn essentially escapes. He basically just kind of gets away, and that's really that, kind of takes off into the tunnels, and Dan Slott leaves it open-ended, for Norman Osborn to come back later on down the line. But what we also end up having here is this notion that Anna Maria Marconi still doesn't know everything that's going on. She doesn't know that Dr. Octopus was in the body of Peter Parker. As far as she is aware, it's Peter Parker who's in love with her. And so what Dan Slott does is he kind of leaves this open and says there will be fallout, there will be consequences, there will be ramifications in the Amazing Spider-Man line of stories when things go back to normal, because what we're basically going to have is Peter Parker having to sit down and explain to the various members of the people in his life who he is and what exactly it was that was going on. So again, it's really kind of a cool bit of storytelling. It's really a pretty interesting tidbit of events that were taking place. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you guys later. Peace.